the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, certain events stand out as uniquely horrifying even by the standards of the 41st millennium. Among the countless atrocities committed across the galaxy, few scenarios inspire as much dread as the capture of a space marine dreadnought by Orks. And when that dreadnought belongs to the Blood Angels, one of the most noble and tragic chapters of the Adeptus Astartes, the horror multiplies exponentially. To understand the full weight of this nightmare, we must first comprehend what a dreadnought truly represents. These towering war machines are not mere vehicles or weapons platforms. They are walking tombs, sacred sarcophagi that contain the barely living remnants of space marine heroes too valuable to let die. When a battle brother suffers wounds so catastrophic that even the superhuman physiology and advanced medical technology of the Adeptus Astartes cannot restore him, when his body is shattered beyond all hope of recovery, the chapter faces a choice. They can grant him the Emperor's peace, allowing the warrior to join his fallen brothers in death, or they can entomb him within the armored shell of a dreadnought, condemning him to a half-life of service that may span centuries or even millennia. The process of creating a dreadnought is elaborate and sacred. The Space Marine's ruined body is carefully prepared by the chapter's tech marines and apothecaries, his broken form suspended in nutrient fluids within the dreadnought's sarcophagus. Neural interfaces are painstakingly integrated into what remains of his nervous system, creating a direct connection between the warrior's mind and the war machine's systems. When complete, the Space Marine becomes one with his new body, perceiving the world through arrays of sensors and auspex systems, manipulating massive weapons as easily as he once wielded his bolter, and crushing enemies beneath feet that weigh several tons each. For the Space Marine entombed within, the experience is both a blessing and a curse. He can continue to serve the Emperor and his chapter, bringing the fury of the Adeptus Astartes to bear against the Imperium's enemies with firepower that dwarfs what any individual warrior could command. But he is also severed from much of what made him human. The simple pleasures of eating, breathing unfiltered air, feeling the sun on his face, all of these are lost forever. Most dreadnoughts spend the centuries between battles in a state of suspended animation, their consciousness dimmed to a bare flicker to preserve their sanity and extend their operational lifespan. They are awakened only when the chapter has dire need of their wisdom or their firepower, experiencing time in fits and starts, brief periods of awareness separated by long centuries of dreamless sleep. Every Space Marine chapter regards its dreadnoughts with profound reverence. These are not simply weapons, but living links to the chapter's history and traditions. A dreadnought pilot might have fought in the founding of the chapter itself, or stood alongside legendary heroes whose names are now carved in the halls of honor. Their wisdom is sought in times of crisis, their combat experience spanning conflicts that few others remember. When a dreadnought falls in battle, the chapter will fight with desperate ferocity to recover the shell, to return their honored ancient to the fortress monastery for final rites and interment in the chapter's mausoleum. To lose a dreadnought to the enemy is considered a catastrophic loss, not merely of a valuable war machine, but of an irreplaceable piece of the chapter's soul. Now, imagine that loss magnified 1,000-fold. Imagine a dreadnought not merely destroyed in honorable combat, but captured alive by the enemy. Imagine that enemy being Orks, the brutal, savage greenskins whose relationship with technology borders on the heretical and whose respect for the sacred approach is zero. Imagine the honored ancient, the revered hero who should be sleeping peacefully between battles or leading his brothers to glory, instead falling into the crude, oil-stained hands of Xenos, who see him not as a warrior or a person, but as scrap to be looted and a puzzle to be taken apart. This is the nightmare we're exploring today. What happens when Orks capture a Blood Angel's dreadnought? How do these savage aliens approach one of the Imperium's most sacred war machines? What fate awaits the Space Marine trapped within, unable to escape, unable to die? forced to endure whatever the greenskins have in store. And perhaps most importantly, what does this loss mean for the Blood Angels chapter? A brotherhood already burdened with curses that would break lesser warriors. The answers are not pleasant. In fact, they represent one of the most horrifying fates that can befall a servant of the Emperor. But to truly understand this nightmare, we must first understand both halves of this equation. We must delve into the unique nature of Blood Angels Dreadnoughts, exploring what makes them different from their counterparts in other chapters. We must examine the Ork psyche and their obsessive relationship with looted technology. Only then can we begin to piece together the awful reality of what transpires when these two forces collide in the worst possible way. The Blood Angels and their Dreadnoughts. The Blood Angels are among the most famous and most tragic of all Space Marine chapters. Descended from the genetic legacy of the Primarch Sanguinius, the great angel who died defending the Emperor during the Horus heresy, the sons of Sanguinius carry within their very genes the psychic echo of their father's death. This legacy manifests as two intertwined genetic flaws that have plagued the chapter for over 10,000 years, the Red Thirst and the Black Rage. The Red Thirst is a vampiric urge, a deep-seated craving for blood that lurks in the psyche of every Blood Angel. It begins as a manageable impulse, something that can be controlled through willpower and the chapter's elaborate blood purification rituals. But it grows stronger over time, fed by each battle, each enemy slain, each drop of blood spilled. Veterans of centuries of service must spend long hours in transfusion caskets, having every drop of their blood scrubbed clean by arcane machinery, fighting a losing battle against the darkness that threatens to consume them. For some, the battle is lost entirely. They succumb completely to the thirst, becoming little more than savage beasts driven by an insatiable hunger. These fallen warriors are either granted the Emperor's mercy or locked away in the Tower of the Lost on the chapter's homeworld of Baal, there to howl away their madness in isolation. The Black Rage is even more terrible. It is a genetic memory, a psychic imprint of Sanguinius's final moments burned into the gene seed of every Blood Angel. When it strikes, usually on the eve of battle, the afflicted warrior's consciousness is overwhelmed by visions of the Siege of Terror. He believes himself to be Sanguinius, reliving the Primarch's desperate duel with the arch-traitor Horus aboard the War Master's flagship. The present falls away, replaced by a bloody tableau 10 millennia old. The affected Blood Angel sees not his battle brothers, but the traitor legions. He hears not the chaplain's commands, but the screams of dying loyalists. He knows with absolute certainty that he must reach Horus, must strike him down, must avenge what has not yet happened, but feels like it is happening now, in this very moment. A warrior in the grip of the Black Rage is nearly unstoppable. He gains a portion of Sanguinius's own superhuman might, boosting his already formidable strength and resilience to truly terrifying levels. He feels no pain, no fear, no doubt. He is a whirlwind of violence, an avatar of vengeance incarnate. But he is also beyond reason, beyond control, beyond redemption. The Black Rage is effectively irreversible. Once it takes hold, the afflicted battle brother will never again know sanity or peace. Rather than waste such warriors or lock them away to die slowly, the Blood Angels form them into a special unit known as the Death Company. These doomed warriors are given black armor, daubed with red crosses symbolizing Sanguinius's wounds, armed with the deadliest weapons the chapter possesses, and led into the most desperate assaults by chaplains who can still communicate basic commands to their maddened minds. They are expected to die gloriously in battle, finding the honorable end that is now their only escape from the madness. Should a Death Company Marine somehow survive the battle, tradition holds that Astarath the Grim, High Chaplain of the Blood Angels, will grant them the Emperor's mercy with his executioner's axe. Now, Here is where the unique horror of Blood Angel's dreadnoughts becomes apparent. The gene seed that carries the flaws of the Red Thirst and Black Rage does not cease to function when a Space Marine is entombed in a dreadnought. The neural tissue, the organic portions of the pilot that remain alive within the sarcophagus, these still carry the genetic curse. A Blood Angel's dreadnought is not immune to the Black Rage. In fact, in some ways, he may be even more vulnerable to it. Consider the circumstances. A dreadnought pilot exists in a state of semi-isolation, sealed within his adamantium tomb, experiencing the world through mechanical sensors rather than organic senses. The connection between his consciousness and reality is already tenuous, mediated by layers of technology and the long periods of suspended animation between battles. When the Black Rage strikes such a warrior, the results are catastrophic in ways unique to his condition. A standard Blood Angel's Marine who falls to the Black Rage can be directed, however roughly, by the chaplains of the Death Company. He can be pointed at the enemy and, if not precisely controlled, at least aimed like a weapon. But a dreadnought pilot consumed by the Black Rage becomes something far more terrible. The madness is amplified by the power of the war machine itself. Here is a warrior who already commands firepower equivalent to an entire squad, now driven by berserker fury and believing himself to be sanguineous during the final, desperate hours of the Siege of Terror. A Death Company dreadnought cannot be easily subdued or controlled. When the Black Rage takes him, he will rampage for days, sometimes weeks, his massive war machine smashing everything in its path. The chapter's tech marines must eventually rig emergency shutdown devices to disable the dreadnought's systems, literally cutting power to the war machine to force it to stop. Only then can the sanguinary priests examine the pilot and make a grim determination. If he retains enough sanity to follow basic battlefield commands, he will be assigned to the Death Company, his dreadnought shell painted black with red crosses to match his doomed brothers. If he has been completely consumed by the madness, unable to distinguish friend from foe, he will be granted the Emperor's mercy, his agonized existence finally brought to an end. Those Death Company dreadnoughts who remain functional are terrible weapons indeed. They are typically armed for close assault, mounting 2 dreadnought close combat weapons known as blood fists, or the even more savage blood talons, massive powered claws that can tear through enemy armor like paper. Some are equipped with magna grapples, magnetic harpoons, that can drag enemy vehicles within crushing range. They are deployed into the most suicidal assaults, places where even the Blood Angel's other warriors would hesitate to tread, and like all Death Company, they are expected never to return. But there exists another variant of Blood Angel's dreadnought that deserves mention, the Furioso pattern. Even Blood Angel's dreadnoughts who have not fallen to the Black Rage often pilot these close combat specialists, reflecting the chapter's preference for aggressive, personal warfare. A Furioso dreadnought eschews the traditional heavy weapons in favor of 2 close combat weapons, becoming essentially a walking embodiment of the chapter's fury. These machines stride into the heart of enemy formations, their weapons whirring and crackling with power fields as they tear through anything foolish enough to stand in their way. The most sacred of all Blood Angel's dreadnoughts are the Librarian dreadnoughts. When a Librarian, one of the chapter's psychers, suffers mortal wounds, he may be interred in a specially modified Furioso chassis. These pilots retain their psychic abilities even within their mechanical shell, wielding both a dreadnought force weapon and formidable psychic powers. They are rare and precious beyond measure, for they combine the wisdom and power of a veteran librarian with the durability and firepower of a dreadnought. Their loss would be felt as a wound that might never heal. Every Blood Angel's dreadnought, regardless of configuration, is revered by the chapter as a living link to their past. Some have served for centuries, even millennia, awakened periodically to share their wisdom or lend their strength in times of dire need. They have witnessed the slow progression of the chapter's genetic curse, seen generation after generation of battle brothers fall to the black rage or the red thirst. They carry within their memories the faces of heroes long dead, the echoes of battles fought in eras that most Imperial scholars consider ancient history. The Blood Angels maintain their dreadnoughts with almost religious devotion. The tech marines who tend these war machines do so with prayers and sacred oils, treating each system check as a holy ritual. The sarcophagi are housed in crypts beneath the fortress monastery, vast halls filled with dozens of sleeping ancients, each one resting until the chapter has need of his service. To visit these halls is to walk among legends, to stand in the presence of warriors who fought alongside Sanguinius himself, or defended Terra during the darkest hours of the Horus heresy, or held the line against Xenos incursions that would have doomed entire sectors. The chapter would rather die to the last man than abandon one of their dreadnoughts on the field of battle. When a dreadnought falls, entire companies will fight their way through enemy lines to recover the shell, to bring their honored ancient home for proper rites and final rest. The pilot's name is added to the rolls of honor, his deeds carved in stone alongside the greatest heroes of the chapter. His service, though ended, is never forgotten. This, then, is what makes the capture of a Blood Angel's dreadnought by Orks such a profound horror. It is not merely the loss of a valuable war machine or even the death of a veteran warrior. It is the desecration of something sacred, the violation of a living relic, the condemning of an honored hero to a fate worse than any death the chapter could imagine. And the Orks, in their brutal simplicity, cannot even comprehend what they have done. To them, it is simply another piece of loot, another chunk of scrap to be taken apart and rebuilt according to their crude understanding of technology. Ork psychology and the culture of looting. To understand what happens when Orks get their hands on a Blood Angel's dreadnought, we must first understand the Ork psyche itself and their unique relationship with technology. The Orks, or greenskins as they are sometimes called, are not simply mindless brutes, despite what their appearance and behavior might suggest. They are in fact the degenerated remnants of an incredibly sophisticated bioweapon created millions of years ago by the ancient Old Ones to fight in the war in heaven against the Necrons and their Citan masters. The original Krork, as these prehistoric warriors were called, were far more advanced than modern Orks. They stood over 12 meters tall, wore power armor more sophisticated than anything the Imperium can produce today, and possessed intelligence that rivaled or exceeded that of the Space Marines. But the Old Ones died before they could complete their creation, before they could fully implement the control mechanisms that would have kept the Krork in check. Without their creator's guidance, the Krork devolved over millions of years, shrinking in size and losing much of their technological sophistication, until they became the Orks we know today. But the Old Ones' genetic programming did not disappear entirely. It remains buried in Ork DNA, waiting to express itself under the right conditions. This is why Orks grow larger and stronger as they fight and win, why the biggest and most successful Orks are also the smartest and most cunning. This is why certain Orks, called odd boys, are born with specialized knowledge already encoded in their genetics. And this is why Orks have a psychic gestalt field that makes their ramshackle technology function far better than it has any right to. The most important odd boys for our purposes are the mech boys, the engineers and inventors of Ork society. A mech boy is born with an instinctive understanding of technology, though he could not explain that understanding to save his life. Give a mech a pile of scrap, and he will subconsciously identify components, understand their function, and know how to combine them into something new. He does not need blueprints or specifications. He does not need to understand the underlying physics or engineering principles. He simply knows that this bit goes here, that part connects to this, and if you weld it all together and give it a good kicking, it will work. This knowledge is not learned but inherited, passed down through the spores that Orks reproduce via. Every Ork emerges from the ground with basic technical knowledge, but mech boys get the lion's share. From their earliest days, their heads are filled with visions of weapons and war machines, images of technologies they do not understand, but somehow know how to build. Where a human tech priest might spend decades studying to understand a single piece of technology, a mech boy just starts building, his hands moving with unconscious expertise as he hammers, welds, and rivets his way to a functional device. The crude, ramshackle appearance of Ork technology is deceptive. While it may look like it was assembled by a drunken child using scrap from a junkyard, which is not entirely inaccurate, it is actually functional and often surprisingly effective. An Ork shooter might be literally a pipe wrapped in leather with nails as ammunition, but when an Ork believes it is a gun and pulls the trigger, it functions as a gun. The Ork's psychic gestalt field, the collective unconscious belief of all Orks that their technology works, helps to bridge the gap between what should be physically possible and what the Orks want to happen. This has led to some misunderstanding in Imperial circles. There is a persistent myth that Ork technology only works because Orks believe it works, that an Ork gun in human hands would be nothing but worthless scrap. This is not entirely accurate. Ork technology does have a real physical basis. Mech boys do understand, on an instinctive level, actual principles of engineering and physics. The WH field does not create function from nothing, but rather provides that extra push needed to make crude but conceptually sound technology operate beyond its apparent limitations. There have been documented cases of humans using Ork weapons successfully. Commissar Yarrick famously wields an Ork power claw, and Ork hunters on Armageddon have been known to use looted greenskin weapons when Imperial supplies run short. The weapons do work, though often not as reliably as when wielded by Orks, and they have a tendency to explode or break down at inconvenient moments. The psychic boost is gone, but the basic functionality remains, at least for a while. Now here is where we get to the heart of Ork culture and why the capture of a Dreadnought is such a significant event. Orks are obsessed with looting. It is not merely that they scavenge enemy technology out of necessity, though that is certainly part of it. Looting is a fundamental aspect of Ork psychology, a drive as strong as their desire for combat itself. A good fight that produces good loot is the height of Orky happiness. The entire Ork technological base is built on the principle of looting and recycling. Orks manufacture relatively little from scratch. Instead, they salvage battlefields, stripping wrecked vehicles and fallen enemies of anything useful. They raid enemy positions specifically to steal equipment and supplies. They even steal from each other, with entire Ork clans like the Death Skulls specializing in the appropriation of other people's belongings. The Death Skulls are so notorious for their thievery that other Orks watch them carefully during cooperative operations, though their skill at acquiring and repurposing loot makes them valuable allies, despite their sticky fingers. When Orks loot something, they do not simply use it as is. That would not be Orky enough. Instead, they modify it, retrofit it, and generally make it more suited to their tastes. This process, which Orks call Orkifying, involves painting the item in appropriate colors, red for speed, blue for luck, yellow for bigger explosions, adding spikes, attaching more weapons, welding on armor plates, and generally transforming whatever they looted into something that looks properly Orky. An Ork with a looted Imperial lasgun will not rest until he has covered it in crude glyphs, maybe attached a chain blade to the barrel, definitely painted it the right color, and quite possibly welded on a couple extra magazines, even if they serve no actual function. Looted vehicles undergo even more dramatic transformation. The Orks will strip out anything they consider unnecessary or too complicated, weld on additional armor, mount more weapons than the chassis was ever designed to carry, paint the whole thing in clan colors, and decorate it with trophies from previous battles. By the time they are finished, the vehicle barely resembles its original form, having been transformed into something uniquely Orky that nevertheless manages to function despite appearing ready to fall apart at any moment. The Ork's ability to loot and repurpose technology extends far beyond simple weapons and vehicles. They have been known to successfully loot Imperial knights, the towering war machines piloted by noble houses of the Imperium, converting them into crude orc walkers controlled by mech boys or wired to orcs who volunteered for the honor of being permanently installed in the machine. They loot Tau technology, which by all rights should be too sophisticated for them to understand, and somehow make it work. They have even looted tyrannid bioorganisms, the cooperation between mech boys and pain boys, orc surgeons, allowing them to capture and enslave living tyrannid creatures to use as weapons or beasts of burden. There is effectively no limit to what orcs will attempt to loot and convert. If they can carry it off the battlefield, they will try to make it theirs. If they cannot carry it, they might steal pieces of it. If they cannot reach it at all, they will at least fantasize about what they could do with it if they could get their hands on it. The bigger and more impressive the loot, the higher the status of the orc who claims it. A war boss who can display truly spectacular trophies, a captured Imperial tank, the skull of a Space Marine captain, a working plasma weapon looted from an Eldar Dire Avenger, gains respect and authority among his peers. This brings us to Orc Walkers, the crude analogues to Imperial Dreadnoughts that Orcs themselves build. The largest of these are Def Dreads, massive walking weapons platforms that represent the Orc attempt to replicate the intimidating presence and firepower of a Space Marine Dreadnought. Like their Imperial counterparts, Def Dreads require a pilot to be permanently installed within the machine, hardwired into the controls in a procedure that requires the combined skills of both mech boys and pain boys. The process of creating a Def Dread pilot is characteristically brutal. An orc who volunteers for this honor, and many do, hoping to become one of the biggest and most powerful orcs in the clan, undergoes crude surgery that strips away much of what makes him an orc. He is sealed within a claustrophobic metal can, provided with only a small slit to see through, and wired directly into the Def Dread's control systems. The procedure is painful and disorienting, forcing the orc to trade away much of his natural orkiness, his ability to run and fight as a proper orc should, in exchange for raw, destructive power. Most orcs quickly come to regret this decision. Trapped in a hot, loud, uncomfortable metal prison, unable to experience proper scrapping the way an orc is meant to, Def Dread pilots often go slightly mad, a condition orcs describe as running in. They become unpredictable and dangerous, sometimes killing the closest thing they can reach in fits of rage. In battle, however, this fury is directed at the enemy, and the pilots revel in the carnage they can cause with their massive weapons and crushing feet. The smaller cousins to Def Dreads are Killer Cans, which are piloted not by orcs, but by Gretchen, the smaller, weaker cousins of orcs who typically serve as slaves and servants. For a Gretchen, being selected as a Killer Khan pilot is simultaneously an honor and a death sentence. It gives them power they could never otherwise possess, the ability to lord it over the orcs who normally bully and abuse them. Gretchen actually compete eagerly for the chance to pilot Killer Khans, with some mech workshops even holding lotteries to decide who gets selected. The procedure for installing a grot in a Killer Khan is even cruder than that used for Def Dreads, though it follows similar principles. The Gretchen is hardwired into the war machine's systems, his body trapped within the metal shell, his consciousness bound to the Khan for the rest of his probably short life. When newly created Killer Khans are activated, they often go on brief rampages, the Gretchen pilots using their newfound power to stomp on orcs who previously tormented them before the mech boys regain control. Other orcs find this hilarious, at least as long as they are not on the receiving end. With this understanding of orc psychology, their obsession with looting, and their willingness to tear apart and repurpose anything they can get their hands on, we can begin to imagine what happens when they capture an intact or mostly intact dreadnought. Here is a prize beyond measure by orc standards. Not just a powerful war machine, but one that already has many similarities to their own Def Dreads. They can see that it has a pilot inside, that it is built around similar principles to their own walkers, that it represents Imperial technology at its finest. And most importantly, they have no understanding whatsoever of what it truly represents, or the sacred nature of what they have captured. To an Ork, a captured Dreadnought is the ultimate loot. It is a challenge and an opportunity rolled into one. The mech boys will immediately begin planning how to take it apart, how to understand its workings, and most excitingly, how to rebuild it as something properly Orky. They do not see a revered ancient, a hero of the Imperium, a living relic deserving of respect and dignity. They see a really big, really interesting toy that they are going to dismantle, study, and ultimately destroy through their crude attempts at comprehension. And somewhere deep inside that Dreadnought, sealed in his sarcophagus, unable to move or escape or even die easily, the Blood Angel pilot can only wait and experience whatever the Orks have in store for him. The capture. Before we can explore what happens after the capture, we must understand how such a catastrophe could occur in the first place. Dreadnoughts are formidable war machines, nearly impervious to small arms fire, capable of crushing infantry beneath their feet and tearing apart enemy armor with contemptuous ease. They are typically deployed as part of larger Space Marine forces, surrounded by battle brothers who would die before allowing harm to come to their revered ancient. How then could Orks possibly capture one alive? The answer lies in the chaos and unpredictability of warfare, particularly warfare against Orks. The Greenskins attack in overwhelming numbers, throwing wave after wave of boys at their enemies with complete disregard for casualties. An Ork, Waaga, the massive migration and invasion force that represents Ork society at its most dangerous, can number in the millions or even tens of millions. Against such numbers, even Space Marines can be overwhelmed, and even the mightiest war machines can be brought low. Consider a typical scenario. A Blood Angel's strike force has deployed to counter an Ork incursion on an Imperial world. Intelligence, always unreliable when dealing with Orks, suggested a relatively small warband, perhaps a few thousand greenskins. But Ork numbers are notoriously difficult to assess accurately. For every Ork you can see, there are likely a dozen more hiding in the surrounding terrain, waiting for the right moment to emerge and join the fight. And Orks reproduce through spores, meaning that any planet they have occupied for any length of time will be thoroughly infested, with new Orks constantly emerging from the ground. The Blood Angels advance into what appears to be enemy-held territory, their dreadnoughts striding at the forefront of the assault. Perhaps one of these is a Death Company dreadnought, his black-painted shell marking him as a warrior who has fallen to the Black Rage, led into battle by a chaplain who has given him final commands before pointing him at the enemy and letting the madness drive him forward. Or perhaps it is an ancient Furioso pilot, a veteran of centuries who has volunteered to be awakened for this campaign, eager to bring the Emperor's fury to the Xeno's filth. The battle begins well enough. The Dreadnought's assault cannon tears through mobs of Ork boys, each burst reducing a dozen greenskins to bloody fragments. His power fist crushes Ork vehicles, flipping over trucks and tearing apart Def Dreads with contemptuous ease. The Space Marines around him advance in precise formation, their bolters barking in controlled bursts, every shot a kill. This is what the Adeptus Astartes do best, bringing overwhelming firepower and superhuman skill to bear in devastating assaults that shatter lesser enemies. But then, the trap is sprung. Orks burst from concealed positions on all sides, thousands of them, more than the initial reconnaissance suggested could possibly be present. The sky fills with Ork aircraft, crude but effective, Defcopters and blaster bombers that rain explosives down on the Imperial positions. Ork heavy weapons teams, positioned on high ground, begin firing at the Dreadnought specifically, recognizing it as a priority target. Rockets and big shooters pour fire into the war machine's armored shell, while mobs of boys surge forward, seeking to swarm it through sheer numbers. The Dreadnought fights with the skill of centuries, but even he cannot be everywhere at once. Ork tank busters, specialist troops armed with anti-armor weapons, work their way close enough to plant demo charges on his legs. The explosions stagger the war machine, damaging critical systems and compromising his mobility. He crushes several of the Orks with his remaining functional weapons, but more greenskins pour in to replace them, clambering over his shell like ants overwhelming a beetle. The battle brothers around him fight desperately to reach their trapped ancient, but they are being overwhelmed themselves. The tactical situation has deteriorated rapidly, turning from a calculated assault into a desperate fight for survival. The captain calls for extraction, ordering his forces to fall back to a defensible position where they can await reinforcement. But the Dreadnought cannot keep pace, his damaged legs barely functional, and the Orks are specifically targeting him, recognizing that this is a prize worth taking. In the confusion of the retreat, separated from his battle brothers by walls of charging Orks, the Dreadnought makes a final stand. He knows what is coming. His centuries of service have taught him that some battles cannot be won, only endured. He activates his last resort protocols, hoping to deny the enemy this victory by destroying himself and taking as many greenskins with him as possible. But before the demolition charges can detonate, an Ork mech, understanding from bitter experience what that particular sound means, fires a custom-built weapon that releases an electromagnetic pulse. It is a crude device, barely functional, but effective enough to scramble the Dreadnought's systems and prevent the self-destruct sequence from completing. The Ork boys swarm over the now helpless war machine, bashing at its armor with choppers and crude tools, looking for weak points. The Dreadnought pilot, still conscious within his sarcophagus, can feel the impacts reverberating through his shell. He tries to activate his weapons, but his systems are locked, frozen by the electromagnetic pulse. He cannot move, cannot fight, cannot even trigger his self-destruct. He can only wait in darkness and silence, knowing that he has fallen into enemy hands, and that death, which would be a mercy, may be a long time coming. The Orks, realizing that they have captured something special, begin the laborious process of hauling the disabled Dreadnought back to their camp. It takes dozens of them, using chains and crude winches, dragging the multi-ton war machine across broken terrain. They argue constantly about who gets credit for the capture, each claiming that his contribution was the most important. Several fights break out during the journey, Orks beating each other senseless over bragging rights, but eventually they manage to deliver their prize to the mech boys. Alternatively, the capture might occur in different circumstances. Perhaps the Dreadnought is a Death Company warrior whose black rage drives him deep into enemy territory, far ahead of his brothers. The madness makes him fearless but also reckless, and he finds himself surrounded, cut off, eventually disabled by sheer weight of fire. Perhaps the Dreadnought is part of a desperate defensive action, choosing to stay behind and hold a critical position, while his battle brothers evacuate civilians. He fights until his ammunition is exhausted, until his weapons are broken, until his shell is so damaged that he can no longer move, and when the Orks finally swarm over him, he is powerless to resist. Or perhaps the capture happens in the most tragic way possible, through betrayal or misfortune rather than honorable defeat. A Dreadnought being transported between war zones might be lost when his ship is boarded by Ork raiders. A Dreadnought in suspended animation within a fortress monastery might be seized when the fortress falls after a long siege. A Dreadnought retrieved from a battlefield might be captured again when the recovery convoy is ambushed before reaching safety. However it happens, the result is the same. A Blood Angel's Dreadnought, containing a space marine who should be either sleeping peacefully between battles or dying gloriously in combat, finds himself instead in the possession of the Orks. His battle brothers, if any survived, will be desperate to recover him, but that may take time during which the greenskins will have the opportunity to examine their prize. And when Orks examine something, especially something as fascinating as a dreadnought, they do not show much restraint or delicacy. The pilot, trapped and helpless within his sarcophagus, can only wait in darkness, wondering what comes next. He may try to reach out psychically to his chapter, but dreadnought pilots are not usually psychers, and even if he were, the thick armor of his shell would likely block such attempts. He cannot see or hear what is happening outside, his sensory systems damaged or deliberately disabled by his captors. He exists in a void of sensory deprivation, alone with his thoughts and his fears, knowing that he is in the hands of Xenos, who have no concept of mercy or honor. And in the Ork camp, gathered around their prize, the mech boys are already arguing about who gets first crack at taking it apart. Initial Ork examination. The captured dreadnought, battered and disabled but still intact, is dragged into the heart of the Ork encampment, a sprawling collection of crude structures built from scavenged materials and surrounded by mountains of junk and salvage. The Greenskins have cleared a space in what passes for their workshop area, a region dominated by the mech boys and their Gretchen assistants. Here, amid the smoke of forge fires and the clang of hammers on metal, the Orks will begin their examination of their prize. The mech boys approach the dreadnought with an excitement that would be almost childlike if it were not so disturbing. To them, this is the ultimate puzzle box, a device that combines elements they recognize. The basic structure is similar to their Def Dreads, after all, with technology far more advanced than anything they typically encounter. They circle the war machine, pointing at various components, arguing in their crude language about what each part does and how it might work. One of the big mechs, the most skilled and respected of the mech boys present, takes charge of the operation. He is a massive Ork, his body covered in bionics and crude cybernetic enhancements, evidence of decades spent working with dangerous machinery. His reputation for building the biggest guns and the fastest vehicles makes his word law among the other mechs. When he declares that he will lead the examination personally, the others grudgingly accept his authority, though they crowd close, eager to see what he discovers. The first challenge is simply accessing the dreadnought's internal systems. Imperial technology uses sophisticated locks and security protocols, designed to prevent unauthorized access and protect sacred machine spirits from contamination. The Orks, of course, have no interest in proper access procedures or respectful treatment of machine spirits. They attack the problem with characteristic directness, using power tools, cutting torches, and when those prove insufficient, shaped charges to blast through access panels and bypass locks. Sparks fly as the mechs cut into the dreadnought's shell, peeling back layers of ceramite armor to expose the mechanisms beneath. They work with surprising efficiency, despite their crude methods, their instinctive understanding of technology guiding their hands even when they cannot articulate what they are doing or why. Gretchens scurry around their feet, handing them tools, hauling away debris, and occasionally getting kicked or swatted when they move too slowly or get in the way. As the outer armor comes away, the Orks begin to see the complexity of what they have captured. The dreadnought is not simply a vehicle with a pilot, as they first assumed. It is a marriage of technology and biology, a fusion of man and machine, far more intimate than anything the Orks create with their Def Dreads. Power cables run alongside neural interfaces. Mechanical systems intertwine with life support apparatus. The whole thing is orders of magnitude more sophisticated than Ork technology, every component precisely crafted and carefully integrated. The big mech is impressed, though he would never admit it. He runs his hands over the exposed mechanisms, feeling the quality of the materials, examining the craftsmanship. Even by Ork standards, where bigger and louder are usually considered better, there is something undeniably impressive about the dreadnought's construction. The mech can sense, in that instinctive way that mech boys understand technology, that this machine is special. It is not just functional, but optimized, engineered with a level of precision that the Orks never bother with. "This is some right proper gubbins," the big mech mutters, using the Ork term for particularly interesting mechanical bits. "Dem humies know how to build stuff, even if they don't make it proper Orky." The other mechs crowd closer, pointing and arguing about various components. One suggests that the assault cannon could be removed and mounted on a truck. Another wants to strip out the power plant for use in a new project he is working on. A third is fascinated by the targeting systems and sensor arrays, crude by the standards of more advanced races, but still far superior to anything the Orks normally use. But the big mech waves them all back. He has found something more interesting than individual components. He has located the sarcophagus, the armored shell at the heart of the Dreadnought that contains the pilot. It is sealed tight, designed to protect its occupant from even the worst damage the war machine might suffer. The mech traces the outline of the sarcophagus with his fingers, following the seals and connections, his mind already working on the problem of how to open it. "There's a humie in here," he announces to the gathered Orks. "A proper live one, all wired up and connected just like our deaf dreads, but fancier." This news causes a stir among the watching Orks. A living space marine, even one trapped in a mechanical shell, represents a significant prize. Space marines are the most feared enemies most Orks will ever face, warriors who can kill dozens of boys before being brought down themselves. The idea that they have captured one alive, albeit in a heavily damaged state, is both exciting and slightly unnerving. Some of the Orks want to crack open the sarcophagus immediately, eager to see what a space marine looks like up close. Others suggest more creative approaches. Perhaps they could rewire the Dreadnought and make the space marine fight for them. Perhaps they could torture him for information, though what information Orks might want from a space marine is unclear, even to them. Perhaps they could put him in an arena and have him fight against Ork champions for entertainment. The big mech considers all these suggestions and dismisses them. He has a better idea, one that appeals to his nature as a mech boy and to the Ork obsession with looting and conversion. They are going to take the Dreadnought apart completely, study every component, learn how the humies built it, and then rebuild it as a proper Orky war machine. And if the humie inside survives the process, well, they will deal with that when they get to it. He issues orders to his subordinates, dividing up the work. Some mechs will focus on stripping away the outer armor and cataloging the major systems. Others will work on accessing the sarcophagus itself. Gretchen will be assigned to sorting through the smaller components, separating usable bits from scrap. It will be a massive undertaking, possibly the most complex project the warband has attempted in years. The work begins in earnest. The sounds of cutting tools and hammering fill the air as the Orks attack the Dreadnought with enthusiastic violence. They have no concept of careful disassembly or preserving the integrity of systems they do not yet understand. When a component resists their efforts to remove it, they hit it harder. When a seal will not break, they cut through it. When delicate electronics are in the way of something they want to access, they rip them out and toss them aside. Inside his sarcophagus, the Blood Angel's pilot can hear all of this. The armor that protects him also transmits vibrations and impacts, letting him feel every blow, every cut, every crude violation of his shell. He cannot see what is happening, but he can hear the voices of the Orks, their guttural language punctuated by laughter and the occasional curse when a tool breaks or a component proves more stubborn than expected. He tries to retreat into himself, to find the meditative state that helps Dreadnought pilots endure the long centuries of half-life. But there is no peace to be found here, no tranquil void where he can rest. The constant noise and vibration keep him jarringly aware of his situation. He tries to remember his training, the lessons in endurance and resilience that all Space Marines learn. He tries to focus on his faith in the Emperor, drawing strength from the certainty that he serves a higher purpose. But even that comfort is slipping away, because he knows, with the certainty that comes from centuries of combat experience, what is coming next. the Orks will not be satisfied with simply examining his shell from the outside. Sooner or later, probably sooner, they will force their way into his sarcophagus itself. They will violate the sanctity of his tomb, expose his ruined body to alien eyes, treat his suffering as nothing more than an interesting engineering challenge to be overcome through application of crude tools and cruder thinking. And there is absolutely nothing he can do to stop them. He cannot move, he cannot fight, he cannot even trigger his self-destruct, which has been damaged beyond his ability to activate. He is completely, utterly helpless, reduced to a prisoner in his own body, forced to endure whatever the Xenos have planned. All he can do is wait and pray to the Emperor for strength to endure what comes next. Outside, the big mech has finally figured out how the sarcophagus seals work, more or less. It is not that he understands the actual mechanisms, but his instinctive mech-boy knowledge lets him identify which components are locks and which are simply structural. He selects a promising seam, one that looks like it might come apart if the right amount of force is applied in the right direction, and calls for a pry bar. "Right then," he says, wedging the tool into the gap. "Let's see what we got in here. Oi, you gits, get ready to grab Dahumi if he tries anything. Space Marines is right killy, even when they's all smashed up." Several Orks move into position, choppers and shooters ready, just in case the Space Marine proves to be more dangerous than expected. The big mech braces himself and heaves on the pry bar, his massive muscles straining against the seal. For a moment, nothing happens. Then, with a grinding screech of metal on metal and the hiss of escaping pressure, the seal breaks. The sarcophagus begins to open, and the Blood Angel pilot, who has endured centuries of service and countless battles, who has survived wounds that would kill normal humans instantly, who has already died once and been reborn in metal, can do nothing but wait to see what fresh horror the universe has in store for him. The desecration process. The sarcophagus seal breaks with a final, protesting screech, and murky amniotic fluid begins to leak out, spilling onto the ground in a spreading pool. The Orks nearest to the opening jump back, surprised by the sudden rush of liquid and the strange chemical smell that accompanies it. The big mech peers into the widening gap, his small, cunning eyes trying to make sense of what he is seeing in the darkness within. What the Orks find when they finally pry the sarcophagus fully open is difficult for them to process. They had expected to find a Space Marine, one of the towering warriors they have fought countless times, perhaps injured or restrained, but still recognizably what he was. What they actually discover is something else entirely, something that challenges even their limited understanding of biology and technology. The Blood Angel pilot is no longer truly human, nor is he entirely machine. What remains of his body is barely recognizable as having once been a person. Centuries of entombment and the catastrophic injuries that necessitated his interment in the first place have reduced him to little more than a torso, portions of a head, and fragments of limbs, all suspended in nutrient gel and wired into a complex web of neural interfaces, life support systems, and sensory apparatus. Tubes and cables run in and out of his flesh, some delivering nutrients and removing waste, others carrying electrical signals that allow him to interface with the Dreadnought systems. His skin, where it is visible beneath the mass of cybernetics, has the pale, almost translucent quality common to Blood Angels, though marred by surgical scars and the ports where augmetics connect directly to his nervous system. His face, or what remains of it, shows the refined features typical of Sanguinius's gene sons, but twisted by pain and the long years of semi-existence. If his eyes are still functional, they are likely clouded or replaced with mechanical optics. His mouth might be permanently fixed open around a respirator tube or sealed shut, no longer needed for speech or sustenance. The Orks stare at this revelation in uncharacteristic silence. Even by their standards, what they are looking at is disturbing. Orks understand injury, they embrace violence as a way of life, but there is something deeply wrong about what they have uncovered. This is not a warrior wounded in honorable combat. This is something that has been taken apart and put back together wrong, kept alive through means that seem to mock the very concept of life. Zogin El, one of the younger mechs finally says, breaking the silence. Dahumi ain't even proper alive anymore. He's more like a big cyborg thingy. The big mech recovers faster than his subordinates. He is, after all, an expert in integrating living orcs into mechanical shells. He has personally wired dozens of volunteers into Def Dreads and overseen the creation of countless kilocans. The principles here are similar, even if the execution is far more sophisticated than anything the orcs achieve. He leans in closer, examining the connections between flesh and machine, trying to understand how the Humies managed to keep this warrior alive and functional for what must have been centuries. "Oi, Doc!" he bellows, calling for one of the pain boys. "Get over here and have a look at this. I need to know if the Humie can survive getting unplugged from all this gubbins." The pain boy, an orc doctor, whose understanding of medicine is roughly equivalent to a human butcher's understanding of surgery, pushes through the crowd of onlookers. He examines the blood angel with the same casual interest he might show in any other piece of meat, prodding at exposed organs, tugging on tubes, and generally treating the Space Marine's body with less respect than most beings would show a side of beef. "He's alive," the pain boy finally announces, as if this were not obvious. "Sorta. Most of his bits is gone, but the important stuff is still working. The Humie's got him all plugged in real good like, keeping the blood moving and the brain thinking. If we pull him out, he'll croak pretty quick, but if we's careful and hook up some of our own life support gubbins, he might last a bit longer." "I don't want him lasting," the big mech clarifies. "I want to know how they did all this, how they made the Humie into part of the machine. If we can figure that out, we could make better Def Dreads, maybe even make them last longer before the pilots go proper mad." This sparks interest among the other mech boys. The chronic problem with Def Dreads is that the pilots go insane relatively quickly, becoming unstable and dangerous even by orc standards. If they could learn from the Humie's techniques, adapt them to orc physiology and needs, they might solve that problem. Of course, the fact that Space Marine Dreadnought pilots are kept in suspended animation between battles, something the orcs either do not understand or do not care about, means their approach might be flawed from the start. But orcs have never let practicality stop them from attempting something that seems like it might work. The examination continues, growing more invasive as the orcs' confidence increases. They begin disconnecting neural interfaces, pulling out tubes, removing cybernetic components, all the while observing the effects on the pilot. The Blood Angel, fully conscious through all of this, experiences each violation as a new assault on his already compromised existence. Without the sophisticated life support systems that kept him stable for centuries, his body begins to fail in ways both predictable and horrifying. Pain, which had been managed by automated systems built into his sarcophagus, comes flooding back. Every nerve that still functions screams in agony as the protective cocoon that had sustained him is stripped away. He tries to speak, to curse his captors, or call for the Emperor's mercy, but his voice, if he even still possesses one, produces only weak, gurgling sounds that the orcs either do not notice or do not care about. The orcs, for their part, are fascinated by the whole process. They take notes in their own crude way, marking down which cables connect to which ports, sketching diagrams that would make no sense to anyone but themselves. They argue constantly about what various components do, their debates sometimes escalating into physical confrontations that have to be broken up by the big mech. When they encounter technology they do not understand, which is most of it, they either put it aside for later study or simply smash it to see what happens. At some point during this process, the Blood Angel loses consciousness, his damaged nervous system simply unable to cope with the accumulated trauma. This is both a mercy and a tragedy. A mercy because it provides temporary escape from the horror of his situation. A tragedy because unconsciousness means he cannot bear witness to what is being done to his body and his shell. cannot maintain the dignity of awareness, even as everything else is stripped from him. The pain boy, seeing that the Humi has passed out, suggests they could experiment with some of his Ork-developed stimulants to see if they can wake him back up. The Big Mech vetoes this idea, not out of any concern for the Space Marine's welfare, but because he does not want the pilot dying before they have learned everything they can from examining his integration with the Dreadnought systems. There will be time for more invasive experiments later, assuming the Humi survives the initial examination. Hours pass, then days. The Orks work in shifts, different mechs taking over when others grow bored or distracted by other projects. They strip the Dreadnought down to its component parts, creating piles of sorted materials. Power cables here, armor plates there, weapons systems in yet another location. The sarcophagus itself is carefully, by Ork standards, disassembled, each piece examined and catalogued in the mech's limited fashion before being added to the growing collection of loot. The Blood Angel pilot regains consciousness periodically, surfacing from merciful unconsciousness to experience new indignities. Sometimes he wakes to find Orks poking at his exposed organs, discussing among themselves whether Humi's insides look different from Ork insides. Sometimes he wakes to the sensation of crude surgery, the pain boy attempting to understand how the neural interfaces work by literally prodding at his brain tissue with primitive tools. Sometimes he wakes to silence, finding himself alone in darkness, the Orks having left him temporarily abandoned while they focus on other parts of the project. In his clearer moments, he tries to retreat into prayer, calling upon the Emperor and Sanguinius for strength. The liturgies and catechisms he learned as a neophyte centuries ago come back to him, familiar words that provide some small comfort in this nightmare. He recites the litany of hate, finding bitter irony in its words as he truly understands, perhaps for the first time in his long service, what it means to hate the Xenos with every fiber of his being. He whispers the canticle of endurance, begging for the fortitude to survive this trial without breaking, without losing what remains of his sanity and his faith. But the Blood Angel pilot is not just any space marine. He carries within his genetic code the flaws of Sanguinius, the curses that haunt all the sons of the angel. The red thirst, which has grown stronger in him over centuries of service, makes the sight and smell of blood, even his own blood, trigger deep-seated cravings he can barely control. The black rage, which may have already claimed him if he is a Death Company warrior, or which lurks just beneath the surface if he has managed to resist it thus far, threatens to overwhelm his consciousness entirely. As the torture continues, as the Orks' crude examination strips away layer after layer of the technology that had kept him stable and sane, the Blood Angel feels himself slipping. The genetic memories of Sanguinius's death, always present in the background of every Blood Angel's consciousness, begin to intrude more forcefully. He starts to experience visions, seeing not the Ork workshop but the decks of the vengeful spirit. He hears not the crude laughter of greenskins, but the sounds of battle during the Siege of Terror. He feels the presence of Horus, the arch-traitor, the beloved brother who became the greatest enemy, and rage begins to build in his hearts. If the black rage fully takes hold of him in this state, helpless and dismembered as he is, it will not grant him the fury and strength it usually provides. It will simply be one final cruelty, forcing him to relive his Primarch's death over and over, while unable to move, unable to fight, unable to achieve the glorious death in battle that is the only escape from the madness. He will spend his remaining time, whether that is hours or days or weeks, trapped in a waking nightmare where past and present blur together into an endless loop of suffering. The Orks, oblivious to the internal struggle of their captive, continue their work with single-minded focus. They have learned much from their examination, though whether they truly understand what they have learned is questionable. They know now that the Humis use extremely sophisticated life support systems, far beyond what Ork technology can replicate. They have seen how neural interfaces can create a connection between a living being and a machine that is more intimate than anything they achieve with their crude hard wiring. They have examined materials and construction techniques that put their own work to shame. And they have decided that they are going to rebuild the Dreadnought as an Ork war machine, incorporating the best elements of Humi technology with proper Orky improvements. The sarcophagus will be torn out and replaced with something more suitable. The weapons will be removed and swapped for bigger, louder Ork equivalents. The armor will be repainted in appropriate clan colors and decorated with all manner of spikes, glyphs, and trophies. And if they are feeling particularly ambitious, they might even try to install an Ork pilot, creating a hybrid Def Dread that combines Humi sophistication with Ork brutality. As for the Blood Angel himself, his fate remains uncertain. The Orks might keep him alive as a curiosity, a living trophy to show off to other warbands. They might try to extract information from him, torturing him in increasingly creative ways in the mistaken belief that he knows something useful. They might simply grow bored with him and discard him, leaving him to die slowly as his unsupported body finally gives out. Or, in the worst-case scenario, they might attempt to integrate him into their rebuilt version of his Dreadnought, forcing him to pilot an orcified mockery of the sacred war machine that was his tomb and his honor. Whatever happens, the Blood Angel knows with certainty that he will not leave this place as he entered it. The warrior who fought for the Emperor across 100 battlefields, who served his chapter for centuries, who was honored with entombment in a Dreadnought when his body failed, but his spirit remained strong. That warrior is gone. What remains, kept alive by Ork technology and Ork interest, is something else. A broken remnant sustained only by the cruel whim of Xenos, who do not even understand what they have done. And in the halls of the Blood Angel's fortress monastery, far away from this nightmare, his battle brothers mourn him as lost, not knowing whether he lives or dies, but certain that if he does live, his suffering is beyond anything they can imagine. They will come for him if they can. They will move the stars themselves to retrieve one of their honored ancients. But until that day, if it ever comes, the captured Blood Angel can only endure, holding on to his sanity and his faith by the thinnest of threads, waiting for death or rescue, or whatever other fate the universe has in store for him. The pilot's nightmare. Within the violated sarcophagus, suspended in a half-world between life and death, the Blood Angel pilot experiences a torment that transcends physical suffering. The body can endure only so much pain before shutting down, before unconsciousness provides merciful escape. But for a space marine, whose enhanced physiology is designed to function through injuries that would kill baseline humans instantly, unconsciousness comes less easily. And for a Dreadnought pilot, whose nervous system has been rewired to interface directly with machines, whose perception of his own body has been mediated through technology for centuries, the boundaries of suffering expand in ways that would drive an unmodified human immediately insane. The first and most fundamental horror is the loss of autonomy. For centuries, the pilot has existed in a state of controlled half-life, sleeping when not needed, awakening for brief periods of service before returning to peaceful suspension. Even in this diminished existence, he possessed agency. He could choose to fight with fury or with tactical precision. He could communicate with his battle brothers, offering wisdom born of his accumulated experience. He could, if circumstances became truly desperate, choose death through self-destruction rather than capture or corruption. Now, all of that is gone. He cannot move because the systems that translated his neural impulses into the Dreadnought's movements have been disconnected or destroyed. He cannot speak because the voxcasters and communication arrays have been torn out during the Orks' examination. He cannot even see or hear the world around him with any clarity. His sensory apparatus damaged to the point where he perceives only fragments. distorted sounds and occasional blurred images that tell him nothing useful about his situation. What he can feel, however, is everything. The Dreadnought's designers never intended for a pilot to experience physical sensation in the traditional sense. The neural interfaces were supposed to translate the Dreadnought's status into abstract information, damage reports as data rather than pain. But with those systems compromised by the Orks' crude tampering, the pilot experiences every violation of his shell as if it were happening to his own body. When the greenskins cut into the armor, he feels it as flaying. When they disconnect life support systems, he feels it as suffocation. When they probe at his exposed neural tissue, the pain is beyond description, lightning burning through every pathway of his nervous system. And unlike a warrior on the battlefield, who can die from his wounds, or at least lose consciousness from blood loss and trauma, the pilot is kept alive by his enhanced physiology and the fragments of life support technology that the Orks have left in place, either out of curiosity about keeping him alive or simple incompetence in fully dismantling his support systems. He exists in a state of perpetual agony, unable to escape through death or unconsciousness for more than brief periods. The psychological dimension of this torture may be even worse than the physical. The pilot is a blood angel, a son of Sanguinius, heir to both the nobility and the curse of the 8th Legion. Deep within his genetic code, imprinted at the molecular level, are the psychic scars left by his Primarch's death. Every blood angel lives with the knowledge that someday, perhaps today, perhaps centuries hence, the Black Rage might take him. He will fall into madness, experiencing Sanguinius's final moments as if they were his own, reliving again and again the moment when Horus struck down the angel. For most blood angels, the fear of the Black Rage is balanced by the possibility of avoiding it, by the hope that they might serve and die before the curse claims them. But for a Dreadnought pilot, the dynamics are different. The isolation of the sarcophagus, the altered perception of time, the long centuries between awakenings, all of these factors make the Black Rage more likely, not less. Many Blood Angels Dreadnoughts eventually succumb to the curse, becoming Death Company Dreadnoughts, and even these cursed warriors are at least given the dignity of dying in battle, of finding release through honorable combat. But the captured pilot has no such hope. If the Black Rage takes him now, in this moment of complete helplessness, it will not grant him the fury and strength to fight his way to freedom. It will simply trap him more completely in a nightmare of genetic memory and present horror, unable to distinguish between the torture of the past and the torture of the present, experiencing both simultaneously in an endless loop of suffering. He can feel it happening, the memories becoming more insistent, more real. The visions that should be mere background noise in his consciousness are becoming louder, harder to ignore. He sees Horus, the War Master, transformed by the dark gods into something monstrous and terrible. He feels Sanguinius's desperation, knowing that he cannot defeat his corrupted brother, but that he must try, must wound him if possible, must buy the Emperor precious seconds in the confrontation to come. He experiences the moment of impact, Horus's taloned hand striking through ceramite and flesh, the sensation of his body failing, of death approaching. But then the vision breaks apart, becomes confused. He is not Sanguinius dying on the vengeful spirit. He is himself, dying in a different way, at the hands of Xenos rather than traitors. The two timelines blur together, past and present becoming one nightmare where he is being killed by Horus and tortured by Orks simultaneously, where the siege of terror and the present moment occupy the same space in his failing consciousness. He tries to pray, to anchor himself in faith, but even that is becoming difficult. The familiar liturgies, recited countless times over centuries of service, now sound hollow in his mind. Where is the Emperor's protection? Where is Sanguinius's guidance? How can he continue to believe in divine purpose when he has been reduced to this, a broken thing in the hands of savages, abandoned by his brothers, forgotten by the universe? These thoughts are borderline heretical, and he knows it. A space marine does not question. A blood angel does not despair. And yet, what else is left to him? He has been trained to endure physical hardship, conditioned to function through injuries that would incapacitate lesser warriors. But no training prepared him for this, for the complete stripping away of every source of meaning and dignity that defined his existence. The hours stretch into days, though his perception of time has become so distorted that he cannot be certain how long he has been captive. The Orks continue their work, their crude examination and dismantling of his shell, but he is only dimly aware of it now. His consciousness is fracturing, splitting into fragments that cannot cohere into a unified sense of self. He is the Blood Angel pilot, ancient and honored. He is sanguineous, dying at the hands of Horus. He is meat and metal, sensation without purpose. He is all of these things and none of them. In his more lucid moments, he wonders if his battle brothers know what has happened to him. Are they searching? Do they mourn him as fallen? Or do they still hope for his recovery? If they could see him now, reduced to this state, would they recognize him as the warrior he once was? Or would they only see a broken relic, a piece of sacred technology that has been irreparably defiled by Xenos hands? He imagines the chapter discovering what has become of him, the horror and rage that would follow such a revelation. Blood angels are known for their nobility and restraint, but they are also capable of terrible fury when provoked. The desecration of one of their dreadnoughts, the torture of an honored ancient, would be an insult demanding immediate and overwhelming response. Entire Ork warbands have been annihilated for lesser crimes against the chapter. But that response, if it comes, will come too late to save him. He knows this with the certainty that comes from centuries of warfare. By the time his brothers learn of his fate and mount a rescue, he will likely be dead, or worse, transformed into something that makes death seem like mercy. The Ork's interest in him is not benign curiosity, but the prelude to worse violations, worse experiments, worse indignities. Perhaps the kindest thing his brothers could do, if they found him now, would be to grant him the Emperor's peace. A bolter round through the sarcophagus, a quick death that ends his suffering and returns him to the Emperor's side. They would mourn him, certainly. They would carve his name in the halls of honor and speak his deeds at the festival of the fallen. But he would be free, released from this existence that mocks everything a space marine is supposed to be. He tries to hold on to this thought, to prepare himself for death, to accept it when it comes. But his enhanced physiology, the same resilience that has kept him alive through centuries of service, refuses to cooperate. His body continues to function, continues to draw breath, continues to process the minimal nutrients the Ork life support provides. He cannot will himself to die, cannot simply let go and slip away into the darkness he craves. And so he endures, because that is all that remains to him. He endures the pain, physical and psychological. He endures the visions of Sanguinius's death and the reality of his own slow destruction. He endures the loss of faith, or if not the loss, then the terrible testing of it, the question of how the Emperor can permit such suffering to one who has served so faithfully for so long. He endures because he is a space marine, a blood angel, a warrior who has been trained never to surrender, never to give up, never to accept defeat, no matter how total it appears. Even now, reduced to a fragment of a fragment, trapped in darkness and agony, he endures. Not because he has hope of rescue or belief that his suffering has purpose, but because endurance is what he was created to do, what his gene seed has programmed into his very cells. But endurance has its limits, even for a space marine. And as the Ork's examination continues, as more systems are stripped away and more indignities are inflicted, the pilot can feel himself approaching that limit. Soon, perhaps very soon, something fundamental will break. His mind will shatter completely under the strain. The black rage will consume what little sanity remains. Or his body will finally fail despite all the technological intervention keeping it functional. When that moment comes, he will know, longer be the honored ancient, the warrior who fought for the emperor for centuries. He will be something else, something less. A cautionary tale whispered among his surviving brothers about the worst fate that can befall a servant of the Imperium. Until then, trapped in darkness and pain, unable to fight or flee, or even die with dignity, the Blood Angel pilot exists in a state beyond nightmare. And the Orks, oblivious to the magnitude of the crime they are committing, continue their work with the casual enthusiasm of craftsmen tackling an interesting project, having no idea that they are torturing a living piece of the Imperium's history, no comprehension of the spiritual violence they are inflicting with every cut of their tools and every prod of their crude instruments. Orkification attempts. Having thoroughly examined the captured Dreadnought and learned what they can, by their standards, from its sophisticated construction, the Orks now move into the phase of the project that excites them most, rebuilding it as something properly Orky. This is where their natural instincts for looting and conversion take over, where their cultural imperative to make everything bigger, louder, and more aggressive overrides any remaining consideration for the original design. The Big Mech has grand plans. He has seen how the Hume Dreadnought was built, and, more importantly, he has decided that the Orks can do better. The Humes may have sophisticated technology and clever engineering, but they lack the raw Orky enthusiasm that makes a proper war machine. Where the Imperial Dreadnought was designed for reliability and longevity, the Ork version will be designed for maximum violence and intimidation. Where the Humes used precision and careful calibration, the Orks will use brute force and aggressive experimentation. The first step in the Orkification process is to strip away anything that the mechs consider unnecessary or too complicated. This includes most of the sophisticated systems that made the Dreadnought function properly in the first place. Delicate targeting computers are tossed aside in favor of simpler point-and-shoot mechanisms. Redundant safety systems, designed to protect the pilot from feedback and system failures, are removed because the Orks cannot figure out what they do and assume they must not be important. The careful calibration of power distribution is replaced with crude wiring that directs maximum energy to weapon systems with little regard for efficiency or safety. The weapons themselves are the next target for modification. The assault cannon that once graced the Dreadnought's right arm, a marvel of Imperial engineering capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute with deadly accuracy, is deemed not killy enough by the mechs. They replace it with an Ork big shooter, a weapon that trades accuracy for volume of fire, creating a cacophony of noise and violence that suits Ork sensibilities much better. The big shooter is crudely welded onto what remains of the weapon mount, with no regard for balance or recoil management. On the left arm, where a power fist once crushed enemy armor with hydraulic force carefully channeled through reinforced servos, the Orks install what they call a claw of Gork, or possibly claw of Mork. The distinction is not always clear even to them. This massive mechanical claw is larger and cruder than the Imperial original, with saw-toothed edges and a tendency to leak oil, but it undeniably looks more intimidating. Additional spikes are welded to its surface, serving no functional purpose, but satisfying the Ork belief that more spikes equals more fightiness. The armor plating receives extensive modification. The careful curves and angles of Imperial ceramite, designed to deflect incoming fire while maintaining mobility, are covered over with sheets of scrap metal welded haphazardly to the shell. These additions make the Dreadnought heavier and less maneuverable, but they also make it look more Orky, which is what really matters. Every available surface is adorned with glyphs, crude representations of Ork symbols of power, as well as trophies from previous battles. Chains are hung from various points, rattling impressively when the walker moves. Spikes protrude at odd angles, some structural but many purely decorative. Most importantly, the entire shell is repainted. The noble red and gold of the Blood Angels, colors that have represented one of the Imperium's greatest chapters for 10,000 years, are covered over with thick coats of Ork war paint. The specific colors depend on which clan the mech belongs to. If he is a Death Skull's mech, the shell will be painted blue because Death Skulls believe blue is lucky. If he is a Bad Moon, it will be bright yellow, the color of wealth and status. If he is a Blood Axe, it might retain some red, though added to with other colors because Blood Axes are known for looting Hume aesthetics. Red paint also gets applied liberally regardless of clan affiliation, because all Orks believe that red makes things go faster. This belief is so strong among the greenskins that, thanks to their psychic gestalt field, red vehicles actually do move faster when piloted by Orks. Whether this effect would extend to a Dreadnought piloted by something other than an Ork is questionable, but the mechs apply the paint anyway, just to be safe. The sarcophagus itself, the sacred tomb that housed the Blood Angel pilot, undergoes the most dramatic transformation. The Orks have decided that the Hume life support system is too complicated and too fragile for their purposes. They rip out most of the delicate machinery, replacing it with their own crude equivalents. Nutrient delivery becomes a simple pump and tank system. Waste removal is handled by the Ork equivalent of plumbing, which is to say, barely handled at all. The neural interface, once a masterwork of bioengineering that allowed seamless connection between pilot and machine, is replaced with direct hardwiring, using techniques the Pain Boys learned from creating deaf dreads. If the Blood Angel pilot has somehow survived to this point, and it is not certain that he has, this phase of the modification represents a new level of horror. The Orks are not merely examining him now, but actively altering the systems that keep him alive, swapping sophisticated Imperial technology for their own brutal equivalents. Each change brings new pain, new dysfunction, new ways for his already failing body to deteriorate further. The Pain Boy, working in consultation with the mechs, might attempt to install additional cybernetics directly into the pilot's body. These are not the careful augmetics of the Adeptus Mechanicus, created with reverence for the human form and the machine spirit, but crude Ork bionics designed for maximum functionality with minimum finesse. If an arm is needed to reach certain controls, the Pain Boy will simply attach a mechanical limb, drilling through bone and grafting it to whatever tissue presents itself as a convenient anchor point. If the pilot's eyes have failed, they might be replaced with crude optical sensors that provide vision, but at the cost of constant pain from the poorly integrated implants. The question eventually arises among the mechs. What should they do with the Hume pilot? He is still alive, more or less, though his condition has deteriorated significantly during their modifications. Several options are debated with typical Ork enthusiasm and complete lack of sentimentality. One faction argues that they should simply dispose of the pilot and install an Ork volunteer instead. This would create a hybrid vehicle, combining Hume sophistication with an Ork driver who actually knows how to proper scrap. The prospect appeals to several Orks, who volunteer immediately for the honor of piloting this unique war machine, though their enthusiasm dims somewhat when they are reminded of what the procedure actually entails. Another group suggests keeping the Hume alive as a curiosity, a living trophy to show that they bested not just any space marine, but one of the legendary Dreadnought warriors. The pilot could be left in his modified sarcophagus and displayed like a museum piece, his suffering serving as entertainment and his presence a reminder of the warband's prowess. A third possibility, and the one the big mech finds most intriguing, is to keep the Hume pilot and actually try to make him control the Orkified Dreadnought. This presents significant technical challenges. The neural interface has been severely compromised by the modifications, and it is unclear whether a Hume brain can successfully pilot a machine that has been rebuilt according to Ork specifications. But the big mech is confident that with enough tinkering, enough trial and error, enough willingness to ignore the pilot screaming when things go wrong, they can make it work. This decision is not made out of any respect for the pilot or desire to preserve his warrior skills. Rather, it is made because the mechs find the idea interesting. They want to see if they can bend a Humi to their purposes, make him serve Ork objectives, turn one of the Imperium's greatest warriors into a weapon for the Greenskins. The sheer audacity of the concept appeals to their sense of humor and their love of causing maximum offense to their enemies. If this path is chosen, the Blood Angel pilot finds himself in a nightmare scenario beyond anything he previously experienced. Not only is he kept alive in agony, not only has his sacred shell been desecrated and converted into a mockery of what it once was, but now he is expected to pilot this abomination, to use his centuries of skill and experience in service of the Xenos who have destroyed everything he was. The first attempts to make him control the modified Dreadnought are predictably disastrous. The neural pathways have been scrambled by the crude rewiring. Systems that once responded to his thoughts with precision now either fail to respond at all or respond in unpredictable ways. When he tries to raise an arm, a leg might move instead. When he attempts to activate weapons, the power plant fluctuates wildly, sometimes cutting out entirely. The feedback through the damaged neural interface causes excruciating pain, making each attempt to control the machine an exercise in torture. The Orks find this hilarious. They stand around the modified Dreadnought, watching it stumble and flail as the pilot tries desperately to regain any semblance of control, and they laugh at the spectacle. To them, this is entertainment, better than any arena fight, watching a Humi warrior who once inspired fear, now reduced to fumbling helplessly with a machine he can barely understand. "Oi, the Humi can't work his own walker anymore," one Ork cackles. "Looks like he needs some proper Orky know-whats." The mechs make adjustments, their idea of helping, which usually involves hitting components with hammers or rewiring systems randomly until something changes. Sometimes these modifications improve the connection slightly. More often, they make things worse, introducing new problems and new sources of pain for the tortured pilot. Through all of this, the Blood Angel endures because he has no choice. His mind, already fractured by trauma and torture, is now being forced to adapt to alien technology that was never designed for him, that violates every principle of proper integration between man and machine that the tech marines of his chapter taught him. He is being twisted, literally and figuratively, into a shape that serves Ork purposes rather than the Emperor's will. If he still possessed the capacity for coherent thought beyond pain and madness, he might reflect on the bitter irony of his situation. He was interred in a Dreadnought to preserve his service to the Emperor, to allow him to continue the fight when his body failed. Now that same preservation has become his curse, preventing death from releasing him from service to the very enemies he spent centuries fighting against. The Orkification process continues for weeks, perhaps months. The Orks are in no hurry, treating this as a long-term project that can be worked on between other activities. New modifications are constantly being added, each one making the converted Dreadnought less like its Imperial original and more like a typical Ork contraption. Extra weapons are bolted on wherever space can be found. Smokestacks are added, belching black exhaust because the Orks think it looks intimidating. More trophies are hung from chains, creating a jingling, clanking sound when the walker moves. Eventually, the mechs decide their creation is complete, or at least complete enough to field test. They have transformed the Blood Angel's Dreadnought into something that might generously be called a Death Dread, but that really defies easy categorization. It is a hybrid abomination, combining the bones of Imperial technology with Ork modifications, driven by either its original pilot, reduced to a broken tool of the Greenskins, or by an Ork volunteer who has been crudely installed in place of the Humi, depending on which option the mechs ultimately chose. The modified Dreadnought is paraded through the Ork camp, shown off to the other Greenskins as an example of mech boy ingenuity. The Orks cheer and bellow their approval, impressed by the sheer audacity of what has been accomplished. They do not see desecration or sacrilege. They see success, a good bit of looting that produced a unique and powerful weapon. And if somewhere deep inside that Orkified shell, a fragment of the Blood Angel pilot remains conscious, he can only experience the ultimate degradation, being displayed as a trophy by the very Xenos he swore to destroy, his suffering transformed into entertainment, his honor reduced to nothing, his service to the Emperor perverted into service to the Imperium's enemies. This is the nightmare made real, the worst fear of every space marine who might someday be interred in a dreadnought. Not an honorable death in battle, not even corruption by chaos, which at least offers the twisted dignity of having chosen damnation, but this, being broken, rebuilt, and forced to continue existing as a mockery of everything they once represented. The spiritual violation. While the physical and psychological horror inflicted upon the captured Blood Angel is profound, there exists another dimension to this tragedy that must be understood to fully grasp its significance within the lore and culture of Warhammer 40k. This is the spiritual violation, the offense committed not just against an individual warrior, but against the chapter itself, against the legacy of Sanguinius, and ultimately against the Imperium's entire religious and military structure. In the Imperium of man, particularly within the Adeptus Astartes, the line between the secular and the sacred is virtually non-existent. Everything is imbued with religious significance. Every weapon is blessed. Every battle is a prayer in action. Every warrior is not merely a soldier, but a warrior priest, fighting in the name of the God Emperor and his saints. The Space Marines are the angels of death, the living embodiments of the Emperor's will, and their equipment is not merely gear, but holy relics. A dreadnought occupies a particularly sacred place in this hierarchy of the holy. It is simultaneously a war machine, a tomb, and a shrine. The pilot within is revered as a living saint, an ancient who has served beyond death, choosing to continue the fight when most warriors would have been granted the Emperor's peace. Every dreadnought shell is consecrated with elaborate rituals. Every activation is preceded by prayers and benedictions. Every battle is an act of faith made manifest through the dreadnoughts, weapons, and fury. For the Blood Angels, this sacred nature is amplified by their unique relationship with their Primarch. Sanguinius was not merely their genetic father and leader, but an actual angel, a being whose physical form displayed golden wings and whose spiritual presence was so pure that even the Emperor, who normally showed little sentiment toward his creations, demonstrated obvious affection for him. When Sanguinius died, defending the Emperor during the Horus heresy, his sacrifice became the central myth of the Blood Angels chapter, the event around which their entire identity revolves. Every Blood Angel carries within his gene seed the genetic memory of that sacrifice. Every Blood Angel knows that he is heir not just to Sanguinius's nobility and martial prowess, but also to his suffering and his curse. The Black Rage and the Red Thirst are not merely genetic flaws, but spiritual wounds, psychic scars left by the death of a being so pure that his loss damaged reality itself. To be a Blood Angel is to live with that wound, to fight against the darkness, knowing that someday it might claim you, and to find meaning in that struggle. A Blood Angel's dreadnought, then, is not just any revered ancient. He is a living link to Sanguinius himself, a warrior who has resisted the curse for so long that the chapter deemed him worthy of preservation beyond normal death. He might have known Sanguinius personally, having served during the Great Crusade or the Horus heresy. He certainly carries memories that span millennia, witnessing the slow development of the chapter's culture and traditions. When he speaks, it is not just his own wisdom, but the accumulated knowledge of generations that flows through his words. The loss of such a warrior to enemy capture is thus not merely a tactical or even moral disaster. It is a spiritual catastrophe, a wound to the chapter's collective soul that goes far beyond the loss of a war machine or even a valuable veteran. It is the violation of the sacred, the profaning of what should be inviolate, the corruption of what should be pure. When word reaches the Blood Angels that one of their dreadnoughts has been captured by Orks, the response is immediate and devastating. The chapter enters a period of mourning that resembles the funeral rites for fallen brothers, but with an added dimension of horror and rage. They mourn not just a death, but a desecration, not just a loss, but a sacrilege. The chaplains lead prayer services in the fortress monastery's chapels, their voices rising in litanies of grief and fury. They speak of the captured ancient by name, recounting his deeds, honoring his service, and imploring the emperor to grant him the peace of true death, rather than allow his suffering to continue. These prayers are not mere formality, but genuine spiritual anguish, the cries of warriors who understand all too well what their brother is enduring. The chapter master calls an emergency council, gathering the captains and veterans to discuss the response. Recovering the Dreadnought, or at least retrieving his remains, becomes the chapter's highest priority. Other campaigns may be delayed, other commitments may be deferred. The Blood Angels will move heaven and earth to reclaim their fallen ancient, or, failing that, to grant him the Emperor's mercy and exact terrible vengeance upon those responsible for his capture. Among the rank and file battle brothers, the news spreads like wildfire, triggering responses that range from grief to rage to grim determination. Veterans who remember fighting alongside the captured Dreadnought feel the loss personally, mourning not just a revered ancient, but someone they considered a mentor or friend. Younger Marines, who have only heard stories of the ancient's deeds, feel the loss as an attack on the chapter's honor and identity. But perhaps most affected are those brothers who understand all too well what the captured pilot is experiencing. The Death Company, those warriors who have fallen to the Black Rage and now fight with nothing to lose, feel a special kinship with the suffering ancient. They know what it is like to be trapped in nightmare, to experience Sanguinius's death replaying endlessly in their consciousness. The captured pilot is experiencing something similar, a torture that blends physical and psychological horror in ways that normal beings cannot comprehend. The sanguinary priests, the chapter's spiritual and medical specialists, are particularly devastated by the news. It is their responsibility to care for the Dreadnought pilots, tending to their physical and spiritual needs during the periods between battles. They know intimately the fragility of the pilot's existence, how carefully they must maintain the delicate balance between keeping the ancient alive and preventing his suffering from becoming unbearable. To think of one of their charges in enemy hands, stripped of all their careful ministrations, subjected to crude Xenos tampering, is almost more than they can bear. Chapter Master Dante, himself over 1,000 years old and one of the longest-serving Space Marines in Imperial history, takes the news with the stoic grief of someone who has lost too many brothers over too many centuries. He has known the captured pilot personally, perhaps served alongside him when both were younger, before Dante rose to command and before the pilot was interred in his Dreadnought shell. The loss is not abstract, but deeply personal, the suffering of a friend whose agony Dante can only imagine, but not alleviate. Dante issues immediate orders. A strike force is to be assembled, composed of the chapter's most veteran warriors and led by a captain chosen for both his tactical acumen and his personal connection to the captured ancient. The mission parameters are simple. Locate the Ork warband responsible, retrieve the Dreadnought if possible, and if retrieval is not possible, grant the pilot the Emperor's mercy and eradicate every last greenskin involved in his capture and torture. But even as these orders are given, even as the chapter mobilizes for vengeance, there is an underlying current of helplessness and despair. The captured pilot might already be dead. He might be so damaged that recovery, even if achieved, would accomplish nothing. He might be suffering torments that make death seem like the best possible outcome. And worst of all, he might be enduring this horror while believing that his brothers have abandoned him, that he has been forgotten, that his centuries of service meant nothing in the end. the spiritual implications extend beyond the chapter itself. Other Blood Angels' successor chapters, those organizations that share the genetic legacy of Sanguinius and the curse of the Flaw, also mourn when they learn of the loss. The Flesh-Tearers, despite their reputation for savagery, observe their own rites of mourning. The Lamenters, cursed with terrible luck, but no less devoted to their Primarch's memory, offer prayers for their distant cousin's soul. Even chapters that have little direct contact with the Blood Angels feel the weight of this loss, recognizing that an injury to one of the Gene Father's sons is an injury to all. For the wider Imperium, assuming the news spreads beyond the chapter itself, the capture represents a different kind of horror. It is a reminder that even the mightiest servants of the Emperor are not invulnerable, that even space marines can fall into enemy hands, that the galaxy's darkness can reach even those who stand as humanity's greatest defenders. Citizens who pray to space marines as if they were saints, who see their red armor and golden insignia as symbols of invincible protection, must confront the uncomfortable truth that these angels of death can suffer, can be broken, can be violated by the very Xenos they are supposed to destroy. The Adeptus Mechanicus, should they learn of the capture, would have their own complex reaction. On one hand, they would mourn the loss of a precious piece of ancient technology, a Dreadnought being a relic that combines sophisticated engineering with irreplaceable craftsmanship. On the other hand, they would be horrified by the thought of such technology falling into Xenos' hands, particularly Orks, who might learn from examining it and incorporate Imperial innovations into their own crude war machines. There is also the matter of theological significance. The Imperium's state religion, the cult of the machine, holds that every machine has a spirit, a fragment of divine essence that must be honored and appeased. The machine spirit of a Dreadnought is particularly powerful and ancient, having served the Omnissiah, as the Mechanicus calls the Emperor, for centuries or millennia. To have such a spirit subjected to Xenos tampering, to have it bound to systems that violate every principle of proper construction and consecration, is a form of spiritual torture that mirrors the physical torture of the pilot. Within the chapter, the capture has another effect that speaks to the Blood Angel's unique nature. It forces every battle brother to confront his own fears about the Black Rage and the possibility of a fate worse than death. Every Blood Angel knows that he might someday fall to the curse, that he might end his days in the Death Company, fighting with madness rather than strategy, hoping for an honorable death before the rage consumes him completely. But the captured pilot's fate represents something worse than that, a continuation of suffering beyond what any warrior should have to endure. Some battle brothers respond to this fear by redoubling their devotion, spending more time in prayer and meditation, seeking to strengthen their resistance to the curse. Others respond with fury, throwing themselves into training with renewed intensity, as if physical preparation can somehow protect them from spiritual violation. And a few respond with despair, wondering if any amount of service or sacrifice can truly protect them from the universe's cruelties. The capture also raises uncomfortable questions about the chapter's practices regarding dreadnoughts. Is it truly an honor to be interred in a dreadnought? Or is it a curse disguised as a blessing? Are the pilots who spend centuries in suspended animation, awakened only for brief periods of violence before being returned to their tombs, truly serving the Emperor? Or are they simply unable to die? These questions have always lurked in the background of Dreadnought lore, but the capture brings them into sharp focus, forcing the chapter to confront the ethical dimensions of a practice they have taken for granted for millennia. The Blood Angels will never abandon one of their own, especially not a revered ancient whose suffering cannot be tolerated. But even as they mobilize for rescue or revenge, they know that the damage has already been done. The spiritual violation cannot be undone. The sacred has been profaned. The honor has been besmirched. Even if they recover the dreadnought intact, even if they somehow rescue the pilot and restore him to his rightful place, the memory of what he endured will remain. It will become part of the chapter's history, a dark chapter that serves as both warning and inspiration, a reminder of the price that warriors pay in service to the Emperor and the depths to which the Xenos will sink. This is the true horror of the captured Dreadnought. Not just the physical suffering or the psychological torment, but the spiritual wound it represents, the violation of the sacred that strikes at the very heart of what the Blood Angels are and what they believe. In a universe where faith and honor are sometimes the only things standing between humanity and extinction, where warriors cling to their ideals because they have nothing else, the capture represents a cracking of that foundation, a moment when the faithful must confront the limits of their protection and the reality of their vulnerability. And in the halls of the fortress monastery, the remaining dreadnoughts, those ancient warriors who still sleep peacefully in their crypts, might somehow sense the suffering of their fallen brother. In dreams or visions, or simple intuition born of shared experience, they might know that one of their own has fallen into darkness. And they might wonder, in the long hours of their suspension, whether the same fate awaits them, whether their own service will someday end, not in glorious death or peaceful rest, but in horror and violation at the hands of enemies who cannot even comprehend the magnitude of their crimes. Possible fates. The ultimate outcome for a captured Blood Angel's Dreadnought depends on numerous variables: the specific Ork clan involved, the competence of the mech boys, the resilience of the pilot, and critically, whether the Blood Angels mount a successful rescue operation before the situation becomes irretrievable. Let us examine the various possibilities, from best-case scenarios that still qualify as nightmares to worst-case outcomes that defy description. Fate 1. Swift rescue. In the best possible outcome, the Blood Angels track down the Ork warband quickly, before the Greenskins have time to inflict irreparable damage. The chapter deploys overwhelming force, perhaps an entire company supported by armor and aircraft, descending upon the Ork camp like the wrath of the angel himself. The Orks, caught off guard by the speed and ferocity of the response, find themselves fighting a losing battle against enraged space marines who will accept nothing less than total victory. The Dreadnought is recovered, along with whatever remains of the pilot. Apothecaries and tech marines immediately begin assessment and treatment, working to stabilize the pilot's condition and repair the damage done to his shell. It quickly becomes apparent that while he has suffered greatly, much of the sophisticated Imperial technology remains intact. The Orks had time to begin their examination, but not to complete their planned modifications. The pilot survives, though he will bear scars both physical and psychological from his ordeal. He is returned to the fortress monastery, where sanguinary priests and tech marines work for months to restore what can be restored. His Dreadnought shell is reconsecrated, ritually cleansed of Xenos taint, and rebuilt according to proper specifications. Eventually, he is returned to the crypts to resume his suspended animation, though he now carries with him memories that no space marine should have to endure. This is, relatively speaking, the happy ending. But it is important to note that even this best-case scenario involves profound trauma and violation. The pilot has experienced capture, torture, and the beginning of desecration. He has felt helpless in the hands of enemies, has doubted the Emperor's protection, has wondered if his brothers would abandon him. These are experiences that will haunt him for the rest of his existence, however long that might be. Future awakenings may trigger flashbacks or traumatic responses. The psychological wound may never fully heal. The chapter itself will also bear scars from this incident. The knowledge that one of their ancients was captured, even if only briefly, will serve as a permanent reminder of their vulnerability. New protocols will be established to prevent similar disasters. Dreadnoughts will be deployed more cautiously, or conversely more aggressively, ensuring they either remain well protected or die in combat rather than risk capture. The entire culture of the chapter shifts slightly, becoming more paranoid, more protective of their honored ancients, more willing to sacrifice other assets to prevent a repeat of this nightmare. Fate 2. Recovery of remains. A more likely scenario is that the Blood Angels reach the Ork camp too late to save the pilot, but in time to recover his remains. The Greenskins have killed him, either accidentally during their crude examination or deliberately once they grew bored with keeping him alive. His Dreadnought shell has been partially dismantled, significant damage done to the sacred systems, but the core components, including the sarcophagus, remain somewhat intact. The recovery team finds the pilot's body, still wired into his violated shell, showing clear evidence of torture and experimentation. They carefully remove him, treating his remains with all the reverence due to a fallen ancient. The chaplain leading the operation speaks the rites of remembrance over the body, commending the pilot's spirit to the Emperor and Sanguinius, acknowledging his suffering and his service. The remains are returned to Bel, where they receive full funeral honors. The pilot's name is carved into the chapter's memorial halls. His deeds are recounted during the annual Festival of the Fallen. His gene seed, if it can be recovered intact, is preserved for use in creating future generations of Blood Angels. His Dreadnought shell, too damaged to be fully restored, is placed in the chapter's reliquary as a memorial to his sacrifice and a reminder of the price of eternal service. This outcome, while tragic, allows for closure. The pilot's suffering has ended. His battle brothers know what happened to him and can mourn him properly. The chapter can honor his memory while also learning from the circumstances of his capture. It is a defeat, certainly, but one that can be processed and integrated into the chapter's collective experience. The psychological impact on the chapter is still significant. Veterans who knew the pilot personally will grieve his loss and the manner of his death. Younger brothers will hear the story as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the mightiest can fall. But there is also resolution, a sense that the story has reached its proper conclusion, painful though it may be. Fate 3. Partial recovery. In this grimmer scenario, the Blood Angels arrive to find that the Orks have made significant progress in their orkification project. The Dreadnought shell has been extensively modified, its sacred form covered in crude Ork additions, its weapons replaced, its systems compromised. Worst of all, the pilot is still alive, but in a state that makes death seem like mercy. The rescue team fights their way through the Ork camp, cutting down greenskins with bolt and blade, driven by fury at what has been done to their brother. When they finally reach the modified Dreadnought, they are confronted with a sight that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. The noble war machine they remember has been transformed into a grotesque hybrid, neither fully Imperial nor fully Orky, a thing that offends every sense of propriety and honor they possess. Inside the violated sarcophagus, they find the pilot clinging to life by the thinnest of threads. The Ork's modifications have kept him alive, but at tremendous cost. His body has been further mutilated, crude Ork bionics grafted onto him in ways that cause constant agony. His mind has fractured under the strain, the black rage finally claiming him completely, or perhaps he has simply broken from the torture, his psyche shattered beyond any hope of repair. The Blood Angels face an agonizing decision. They can attempt to extract the pilot and return him to Bel for treatment, but the apothecaries present immediately recognize that his condition is terminal. The Ork modifications have introduced infections and incompatibilities that Imperial medicine cannot address. He will die. The only question is when and how much he will suffer in the interim. Alternatively, they can grant him the Emperor's peace here and now, ending his torment with a merciful bolter round, allowing him to die on the battlefield as a warrior should. The decision falls to the senior officer present, likely a chaplain or captain, who understands both the tactical situation and the spiritual dimensions of this choice. After a moment of silent prayer, seeking guidance from the Emperor and Sanguinius, the officer makes the only choice possible. He approaches the ruined sarcophagus, speaks the final benedictions, and delivers the killing blow. The pilot's suffering ends instantly, his tormented spirit released to join his Primarch in the Emperor's halls. The body is recovered despite the ongoing battle around them. Blood Angels fight with desperate fury to protect their fallen brother's remains, holding off waves of Orks long enough to extract the sarcophagus and retreat to their extraction point. The modified shell, too contaminated by Xenos taint to be worth salvaging, is destroyed in place using demo charges that reduce it to molten slag. Back at the Fortress Monastery, the pilot receives full honors despite the circumstances of his death. The chapter acknowledges his suffering, his endurance, and his ultimate sacrifice. But there is also a darkness that settles over those who participated in the rescue, a haunting awareness of what their brother endured. Some of the Battle Brothers who witnessed the orkified Dreadnought and the broken pilot within will carry nightmares of that sight for decades to come. This outcome provides closure of a sort, but it is a bitter closure. The pilot is dead, but only after enduring days or weeks of torture. The chapter recovered his body, but only after the Xenos had violated and desecrated it. There is victory in denying the Orks their prize, in ensuring that the pilot did not die in captivity, but on the battlefield surrounded by his brothers. But it is a hollow victory, purchased at a price that seems far too high. Fate. 4. The orkified Dreadnought. In perhaps the most disturbing scenario, the Blood Angels arrive too late or not at all. The Orks complete their modification project, successfully converting the Imperial Dreadnought into something that serves their purposes. What happens next depends on critical choices the mech boys made during the conversion process. If they removed the Blood Angel pilot and installed an Ork volunteer, the result is a hybrid Def Dread that combines Imperial sophistication with Ork aggression. The new pilot, wired into systems he barely understands, controls a war machine that is significantly more deadly than a typical Ork walker. The mechs have learned from examining Imperial technology and incorporated those lessons into their creation. The orkified Dreadnought becomes a centerpiece of the warband, a weapon that other Orks admire and fear in equal measure. The original pilot's fate in this scenario is unclear, but almost certainly grim. His body might be discarded, tossed aside once the Orks extracted him from the sarcophagus, and determined he was no longer useful. He would die from his injuries within hours or days, his suffering finally ended by the simple expedient of the Orks no longer caring enough to keep him alive. Alternatively, they might keep him as a trophy or curiosity, displaying his broken form as evidence of their victory over the Space Marines. In this case, his death comes more slowly, from starvation, infection, or simply the cumulative effects of his injuries overwhelming his enhanced physiology. But there is an even darker possibility, one that represents the absolute worst-case scenario. The Orks succeed in keeping the original pilot alive and connected to the modified systems. Through a combination of luck, crude skill, and the resilience of Space Marine biology, they force him to continue functioning as the pilot of his own desecrated shell. In this nightmare, the Blood Angel finds himself not merely a prisoner but a slave, forced to operate a war machine that has been converted to serve the enemies of the Imperium. The neural interface, damaged but still functional, compels him to respond to control inputs. The Orks, through trial and error and liberal application of torture, have learned which stimulus produces which response. They treat him like a particularly sophisticated piece of equipment, a cogitator that occasionally needs to be beaten to function properly. The pilot experiences his worst fear realized. He is not merely suffering, but actively used as a weapon against his own brothers. When the orkified Dreadnought goes into battle, perhaps against Imperial forces or even against other Blood Angels, he is forced to fire its weapons, to crush his former allies beneath its feet, to participate in his own ultimate dishonor. He retains enough consciousness to understand what is happening, but lacks any ability to resist or sabotage the Ork's control. His mind, already fractured by torture and the Black Rage, splinters further under this ultimate violation. He experiences his existence as a fragmented nightmare, where past and present, loyalty and betrayal, Sanguinius and Horus, all blur together into an incomprehensible chaos. He is simultaneously the honored ancient defending the Imperium and the traitor serving Xenos masters. He is both victim and perpetrator, suffering and causing suffering, dying and unable to die. The Orks, oblivious to the magnitude of what they have done, treat the whole thing as a tremendous joke. They have taken one of the Imperium's mightiest warriors and turned him into their own weapon. They boast about it to other warbands, showing off their prize and claiming bragging rights for having accomplished something no other Orks have managed. The Orkified Dreadnought becomes famous in its own right, acquiring a reputation among the Greenskins as a particularly dangerous and impressive war machine. This fate continues until one of several endings occurs. The pilot might die from accumulated damage, his body finally giving out despite all efforts to sustain it. The Orks might grow bored or frustrated with maintaining the complex system and simply abandon it, leaving the pilot to perish from neglect. The Orkified Dreadnought might be destroyed in battle, either by enemy action or by self-destruction, if the pilot manages to regain enough control to trigger what remains of his failsafes. Or, in the outcome that represents the Blood Angel's worst nightmare realized, the chapter might encounter the Orkified Dreadnought in battle, not recognizing what it truly is until too late. They might destroy it in combat, believing they are facing a standard Ork Def Dread, only to discover afterward from recovered wreckage that they have just killed one of their own honored ancients. The psychological impact of this revelation, the knowledge that they were forced to destroy what they should have rescued, would be devastating beyond measure. Fate 5. Lost to history. Finally, there is the possibility that the captured dreadnought simply disappears, its ultimate fate unknown. The Blood Angels search but find no trace. The Ork warband responsible has moved on or been destroyed by other forces. The modified dreadnought is lost somewhere in the vast expanse of the galaxy, its current status a mystery that may never be solved. This uncertainty might be worse than any confirmed fate. The chapter knows one of their ancients was captured, but does not know if he lives or died, suffers or found peace. Every report of an unusual Ork war machine must be investigated. Every rumor of a modified dreadnought must be pursued. The Blood Angels can never fully close this wound because they lack the information needed to properly mourn or seek vengeance. The missing pilot becomes a legend within the chapter, his name spoken with mixture of reverence and sorrow. New recruits hear the story as a warning about the price of failure and the importance of never leaving a brother behind. Veterans see him as a symbol of sacrifice, a reminder that service to the Emperor sometimes demands more than even death can pay. Decades might pass, even centuries, before the truth is finally discovered. Perhaps archaeological teams find wreckage matching the missing dreadnought's specifications. Perhaps an inquisitor investigating Ork activities uncovers records that shed light on the fate of the captured ancient. Perhaps the Blood Angels themselves encounter the Orkified Dreadnought in some far-flung corner of the galaxy, finally solving the mystery, but at the cost of confronting the horror of what their brother became. Or perhaps the truth is never discovered. Perhaps the pilot's ultimate fate remains unknown forever. One more mystery among the countless tragedies of the 41st millennium. In this case, he becomes a ghost haunting the chapter's collective memory. A brother who never came home, whose suffering and death remain unwitnessed and unresolved. The chapter's response and vengeance. Regardless of the specific fate of the captured pilot, the Blood Angels' response to the capture itself follows predictable patterns shaped by their culture, their faith, and their genetic legacy. The chapter does not respond to such violations with cold logic or calculated restraint. They respond with fury that echoes their Primarch's own righteous anger, with determination that reflects their nobility, and with violence that reminds the galaxy why they are called the Angels of Death. The first priority is always recovery or revenge. A strike force is assembled with all possible speed, drawing on whatever resources are immediately available. If the chapter has multiple companies deployed across different war zones, one is recalled specifically for this mission. If specialized units like the Death Company or Sanguinary Guard are available, they are included in the force, their particular skills and fury making them ideal for an operation driven as much by emotion as by tactics. The strike force is typically led by a chaplain rather than a standard captain, reflecting the spiritual dimensions of the mission. The chaplain's role is not just to command, but to maintain the chapter's focus on the sacred nature of their objective. They are not merely retrieving a war machine or avenging a fallen brother. They are cleansing a desecration, purifying what has been defiled, and ensuring that the galaxy understands the consequences of violating the sacred bonds between a chapter and its honored dead. The battle, when it comes, is conducted with a ferocity that surprises even the Orks, who are not easily intimidated by enemy aggression. Blood Angels attack with the single-minded fury of warriors who have been personally insulted, who fight not just for victory, but for honor, for vengeance, for the vindication of their chapter's values. They show no mercy, take no prisoners, and accept no surrender. Every Ork involved in the capture and torture of their ancient must die, and their deaths must serve as warning to any other Xenos who might consider similar crimes. The assault typically begins with a drop pod or aerial insertion, blood angels falling from the sky like the angels of their namesake, their red armor and golden insignia bright against whatever terrain they are fighting across. The Death Company, if present, are unleashed first, their black rage making them perfect weapons for this kind of righteous slaughter. They throw themselves at the Orks with abandon, caring nothing for tactics or survival, focused only on killing as many of the enemy as possible before their own inevitable deaths. Behind the Death Company come the Assault Marines, using their jump packs to navigate the battlefield with lethal grace, striking at key targets and sowing chaos among the Ork ranks. Tactical squads provide fire support, their bolters speaking death with each precisely aimed burst. Devastator squads hang back, using heavy weapons to destroy Ork vehicles and fortifications that might slow the advance. And throughout the battle, the Blood Angels are calling out for their captured brother, searching for any sign of the Dreadnought or its remains. Tech Marines carry specialized equipment designed to detect Imperial power signatures. Apothecaries stand ready to provide immediate medical aid if the pilot is found alive. Every Blood Angel on the battlefield knows that their primary objective is not defeating the Orks, but recovering. They're ancient, and they will sacrifice their own lives without hesitation to achieve that goal. When the Dreadnought is finally located, the response depends on its condition. If it is intact or relatively undamaged, the recovery becomes the new focus of all operations. A defensive perimeter is established around the position. Tech Marines begin the delicate work of assessing the Dreadnought's status and preparing it for transport. The rest of the force holds off any Ork counterattacks, buying time for the recovery operation to succeed. If the Dreadnought has been significantly modified or destroyed, the emphasis shifts to recovering whatever remains can be salvaged, particularly the sarcophagus and any organic remains of the pilot. These are treated with extreme reverence, handled as carefully as battlefield conditions allow. The corrupted Ork modifications are either removed and destroyed, or, if time does not permit such careful work, the entire structure is destroyed with explosives to prevent the Xenos from reclaiming any part of their desecration. Throughout this process, the chaplain leading the operation maintains a running dialogue with the Emperor and Sanguinius, speaking prayers and benedictions over the recovered remains, performing rites of purification and consecration, ensuring that proper spiritual protocols are followed even in the midst of combat. This is not merely theater or formality, but a necessary component of the recovery process. The Blood Angels genuinely believe that their rituals have power, that their prayers provide protection and cleansing, that they are not just retrieving equipment, but reclaiming something holy from profane hands. Once the primary objective is achieved or determined to be impossible, the Blood Angels turn their full attention to the systematic annihilation of every Ork in the vicinity. This is not strategic targeting or precision warfare, but deliberate genocide, the eradication of an enemy who has earned the chapter's absolute hatred. They pursue fleeing orcs into the surrounding terrain, hunting them down one by one. They burn orc structures and vehicles, leaving nothing standing. They salt the earth, metaphorically and sometimes literally, ensuring that this location can never again serve as a base for greenskin operations. The fury that drives this slaughter is not mindless or uncontrolled, despite its intensity. The Blood Angels maintain their tactical discipline throughout, using their rage as a weapon rather than allowing it to use them. But they also indulge it, allowing themselves to express the grief and anger that their brother's capture has provoked. For warriors who normally pride themselves on restraint and nobility, this expression of pure fury serves as catharsis, a necessary release of emotions that cannot be safely contained. The operation typically concludes with the complete destruction of the orc encampment and the deaths of every greenskin present. The Blood Angels, then, establish a temporary shrine at the location where their ancient was found, marking it with the chapter's iconography and speaking final prayers for his soul. This shrine remains until extraction is complete, a statement to the universe that this ground has been consecrated by Blood Angels' blood and honor. The return to Bel is somber regardless of whether the pilot was recovered alive, dead, or not at all. The strike force arrives not with the triumphant celebrations that might accompany other successful operations, but with the quiet dignity appropriate to a funeral detail. They have achieved their objective, but the cost and circumstances rob the achievement of any joy. If the pilot's remains were recovered, they are transported with full honors. The sarcophagus is borne by honored veterans who might have served alongside the fallen ancient during his centuries of service. The entire chapter assembles to witness the return, standing in silent ranks as their brother comes home one final time. Chaplains lead the procession through the fortress monastery, speaking the rites of remembrance, recounting the pilot's deeds, acknowledging his sacrifice. The funeral ceremony itself is elaborate, befitting a warrior who served the emperor for centuries. The pilot's remains are cremated according to Blood Angel's tradition, his ashes mingled with those of other fallen heroes in the chapter's ossuary. His name is carved in letters of gold on the walls of the Hall of Heroes, joining the thousands of other names that record the chapter's long and bloody history. His gene seed, if it could be recovered, is preserved with special reverence, considered blessed by the suffering its bearer endured. But the chapter's response does not end with funeral rites. The loss of a dreadnought, particularly under such horrific circumstances, prompts serious examination of chapter practices and protocols. How was the capture allowed to happen? What failures of intelligence or tactics permitted an honored ancient to fall into enemy hands? What can be done to prevent similar disasters in the future? These questions are not asked in a spirit of blame or recrimination, but of learning and improvement. The Blood Angels understand that even the best warriors can be overwhelmed by circumstance, that even the most careful plans can fail in the chaos of battle. But they also understand that each failure provides lessons that must be learned if future brothers are to be better protected. New protocols may be established requiring dreadnoughts to fight in pairs, each ancient supported by another, so that neither can be isolated and captured. Tactical doctrines may be revised to provide better extraction procedures when dreadnoughts are disabled. Training exercises may be implemented specifically addressing scenarios where honored ancients must be recovered from enemy-held territory. The chapter also re-examines its relationship with its dreadnoughts on a deeper, more philosophical level. The captured pilot's ordeal has forced them to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of eternal service and the price it demands. Is it truly an honor to preserve a warrior beyond death, when that preservation creates the possibility of suffering beyond what any warrior should endure? Are they serving the pilot's best interests, or the chapter's needs, when they enter mortally wounded brothers in dreadnought shells? These are not questions the Blood Angels are comfortable asking, much less answering. Their entire culture revolves around concepts of eternal service, unending duty, and the nobility of sacrifice. To question whether interring brothers in dreadnoughts is right would be to question fundamental assumptions that have guided the chapter for 10 millennia. And yet the captured pilot's fate makes the question impossible to ignore entirely. In practice, the Blood Angels do not change their fundamental approach to dreadnoughts. The tradition is too old, too revered, too central to the chapter's identity to be abandoned or even significantly modified. But they do gain a deeper appreciation for the burden their honored ancients bear, a more profound respect for the sacrifice that continued service represents. Future awakenings of dreadnoughts are accompanied by even more elaborate rituals, the chapter's gratitude and reverence expressed through ceremony and prayer. And they make a vow, spoken formally during the next festival of the Fallen and repeated every year thereafter. Never again will a Blood Angel's dreadnought be abandoned to enemy capture if any alternative exists. The chapter will spend any resource, take any risk, accept any cost to prevent a repetition of this tragedy. If one of their ancients falls in battle, they will recover him or die trying. If one is captured, they will mount immediate rescue operations regardless of other commitments. And if recovery proves impossible, they will ensure that their brother receives the Emperor's mercy rather than prolonged torment at enemy hands. This vow is not empty rhetoric, but genuine commitment, backed by the full force of the chapter's resources and resolve. In future conflicts, where Blood Angels dreadnoughts are deployed, the chapter ensures that backup plans and contingencies are in place specifically to address the possibility of disabled or captured ancients. Extraction teams stand ready. Kill switches and self-destruct mechanisms are regularly tested and updated. Communication protocols are established so that dreadnought pilots can request the Emperor's mercy if capture becomes inevitable. These precautions cannot prevent all disasters. The galaxy is vast, warfare is chaotic, and even the best plans can fail. But they represent the Blood Angels' determination that their brothers will not suffer needlessly, that the honored dead will be protected with the same dedication they showed while living, that the chapter's values of brotherhood and honor extend even to those who exist in the twilight state between life and death. The broader implications for the Imperium. The capture and torture of a Blood Angel's dreadnought by Orks represents more than a tragedy for a single chapter or even a single space marine. It reflects broader truths about the Imperium of man, the nature of warfare in the 41st millennium, and the grim mathematics of a civilization that spans 1 million worlds but teeters constantly on the brink of extinction. At the most fundamental level, this scenario illustrates the Imperium's core philosophy regarding its warriors and their equipment. Nothing is too sacred to be risked. No one is too valuable to be expended. The Emperor's servants fight and die across countless battlefields, and sometimes their deaths are not clean or quick or dignified. Sometimes they suffer. Sometimes they are captured, tortured, corrupted, or worse. And the Imperium, for all its prayers and rituals, for all its talk of honor and nobility, cannot always protect them. This brutal pragmatism extends even to Space Marines, the Imperium's elite warriors, its greatest heroes, its living angels of death. For all their enhancements and training, for all their sacred equipment and elaborate support infrastructure, Space Marines can still fall victim to circumstances beyond their control. They can be overwhelmed by sheer numbers, betrayed by intelligence failures, or simply caught in situations where valor and skill are not enough to ensure survival. The dreadnoughts represent an attempt to cheat this reality, to preserve valuable warriors and experience beyond the normal limits of mortality. But as the captured Blood Angel's fate demonstrates, this attempt comes with its own costs and risks. By extending service beyond death, by keeping consciousness alive in circumstances that would normally grant the mercy of eternal rest, the Imperium creates the possibility of suffering that transcends normal human experience. This raises uncomfortable questions about the Imperium's values and priorities. Is it right to subject even willing volunteers to centuries of half-life, awakening them periodically for service, but condemning them to long stretches of dreamless suspension? Is it ethical to deny death to warriors whose bodies have been destroyed, keeping them alive through technology that reduces them to little more than brains in armored shells? Does the preservation of experience and capability justify the potential for suffering that Dreadnought pilots must accept as the price of their continued service? The Imperium's answer to these questions is essentially pragmatic rather than philosophical. Dreadnoughts are valuable assets. They combine the tactical knowledge of veterans with firepower that few individual warriors can match. They serve as living symbols of the chapter's history and traditions. They provide continuity and wisdom that helps guide current generations. From a purely utilitarian perspective, preserving them makes sense, regardless of the personal cost to the pilots themselves. But this utilitarian logic sits uneasily alongside the Imperium's religious rhetoric about honor, nobility, and service. The Imperium tells its citizens and soldiers that their sacrifices have meaning, that their suffering serves the Emperor's plan, that even death in his service is glorious. Yet the reality of warfare in the 41st millennium often contradicts these comforting narratives. Death is frequently neither glorious nor meaningful, but simply brutal and random. The captured Dreadnought's fate exposes this contradiction with particular clarity. Here is a warrior who did everything right, who served with distinction for centuries, who was honored with preservation beyond death as recognition of his valor. And his reward for that service was to be captured by Xenos, tortured, desecrated, and either killed or enslaved to serve the very enemies he spent his life fighting. Where is the meaning in that? Where is the glory? How does his suffering serve the Emperor's plan, except as a demonstration of the universe's cruel indifference to human concepts of justice and fairness? These are dangerous questions, the kind that lead to loss of faith, to despair, potentially to heresy. The Imperium's ideological structures are designed to prevent such questioning, to provide frameworks that make even senseless suffering seem purposeful. But individuals who witness or experience extreme trauma, like the Blood Angels who recovered their tortured ancient, sometimes find those frameworks insufficient. They are left to wrestle privately with doubts that they can never fully articulate or resolve. The scenario also highlights the technological and logistical challenges the Imperium faces in prosecuting its endless wars. The Imperium's technology, while sophisticated, is not unlimited or infallible. Equipment breaks down, supply lines are disrupted, intelligence fails. And when these mundane failures occur, even Space Marines, even Dreadnoughts, can fall victim to enemies who should, by all rights, be incapable of threatening them. The Orks' successful capture and desecration of a Dreadnought demonstrates their potential despite their crude culture and ramshackle technology. They are not mindless savages, but dangerous adversaries capable of tactical thinking, technological innovation, and strategic planning when circumstances demand it. Their ability to not just capture, but understand and modify advanced Imperial equipment shows an adaptability that makes them an existential threat to humanity. This adaptability is precisely why the Imperium fights so desperately to prevent technology from falling into Xenos' hands. Every piece of Imperial equipment captured by Orks, every weapon or vehicle they manage to loot and study, potentially contributes to their technological development. The mech boys might not fully understand what they are examining, but their instinctive engineering knowledge allows them to incorporate elements of captured technology into their own designs. A Dreadnought represents particularly valuable intelligence for Orks interested in improving their own walkers. By examining how the Imperium integrates pilot and machine, how it manages life support and neural interfaces, how it balances mobility and firepower, the mechs can learn lessons applicable to their death dreads and killer cans. Even if they cannot replicate Imperial sophistication, even if they can only incorporate crude versions of what they observe, that still represents an improvement in their capabilities. This is why Space Marine chapters fight so desperately to recover fallen dreadnoughts, and why they will, if recovery is impossible, destroy them rather than allow the enemy to examine them. It is not just about honor or sentiment, though those factors certainly matter. It is also about maintaining the technological advantage that allows the Imperium's relatively small number of Space Marines to stand against enemy forces that outnumber them thousands or millions to one. The broader Imperium, the citizens and soldiers who are not Space Marines, would likely respond to news of this incident with horror mixed with confusion. Most Imperial citizens have only vague understanding of what Space Marines are, seeing them as legendary warrior angels rather than actual soldiers. The idea that such beings can be captured, can suffer, can be violated by Xenos, challenges the mythological narratives that give many citizens hope and courage in dark times. For Imperial Guard regiments who sometimes fight alongside Space Marines, the news would be sobering in different ways. These soldiers have seen Space Marines in action, have witnessed their apparent invincibility, have come to rely on their presence as guarantor of victory. Learning that even dreadnoughts can be captured and tortured reminds them that no one, not even the angels of death themselves, is truly safe in the galaxy's endless war. The Adeptus Mechanicus, as mentioned earlier, would have complex reactions combining religious horror, technical fascination, and practical concern. The desecration of machine spirits, the corruption of sacred technology, the possibility of Xenos learning from Imperial designs, all these factors would provoke strong responses from Mars and its Forge worlds. Depending on the specific circumstances, the Mechanicus might dispatch their own forces to assist in recovery operations, or to study the aftermath, their interest in the technical aspects of the violation complementing the Blood Angels' focus on the spiritual and personal dimensions. Other Space Marine chapters would also take note of the incident, though their responses would vary based on their relationships with the Blood Angels and their own cultural values. Chapters known for brotherhood and mutual support, like the Ultramarines or the Salamanders, would offer condolences and possibly assistance. More isolated or suspicious chapters might view the incident as evidence of the Blood Angels' declining capabilities or the corrupting influence of their genetic flaws. And across the Imperium, in millions of chapels and shrines, priests and preachers would incorporate this story into their sermons, shaping it to fit whatever message they wish to convey to their congregations. Some would emphasize the suffering and sacrifice, holding up the captured pilot as an exemplar of faithful service, even unto torture and death. Others would focus on the Blood Angels' vengeance, using the story to illustrate the righteousness of fury directed at Xenos enemies. Still others would use it as warning about the dangers of pride or overconfidence, suggesting that even the mightiest can fall if they forget their reliance on the Emperor's protection. In this way, the individual tragedy becomes a myth, a story that transcends its specific details to serve broader ideological purposes. The actual pilot, the real Space Marine who suffered and died or continued suffering in captivity, becomes abstracted into a symbol, a cautionary tale, an inspiration, or a justification, depending on who is telling the story and what lesson they wish to teach. This mythologizing is both inevitable and somewhat tragic. It allows the Imperium to extract meaning and utility from senseless suffering, to integrate even its most horrible disasters into narratives that reinforce faith and devotion. But it also erases the human or transhuman reality of what occurred. The individual warrior's pain becomes secondary to the story's message. His actual experiences matter less than what his experiences can be made to represent. For the Blood Angels themselves, maintaining the truth beneath the myth becomes an act of devotion. They preserve the full, unvarnished account of what happened, keeping it in their chapter archives where it can serve as genuine warning rather than simplified parable. They remember their brother as he actually was, not as he becomes in popular retellings. They honor his suffering by acknowledging its reality, rather than sanitizing it into something more palatable. This commitment to truth, to bearing witness even when witness is painful, reflects the Blood Angels' nobility at its finest. They do not hide from difficult realities or pretend that service to the Emperor always follows heroic narratives. They accept that sometimes their brothers suffer without purpose, die without glory, and endure horrors that should never be inflicted on any sentient being. And they continue fighting anyway, not because they have comforting illusions about war's nobility, but because someone must stand against the darkness, even knowing the full price that standing might require. Conclusion. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the capture of a Blood Angel's Dreadnought by Orks represents one of the most profound horrors that can befall a servant of the Emperor. It is a violation that transcends the physical, encompassing psychological, spiritual, and cultural dimensions that make it a wound not just to an individual, but to an entire chapter and, by extension, to the Imperium itself. We have explored the many facets of this nightmare. The sacred nature of dreadnoughts as both war machines and living relics. The unique curse that Blood Angels carry in their gene seed. The Ork psychology that views everything as potential loot without any conception of sacrilege or violation. The various ways such a capture might occur despite the best efforts of the Space Marines to prevent it. The crude examination and orkification process that reduces a noble warrior to broken meat and corrupted metal. The pilot's internal experience of suffering beyond description. And the multiple possible fates, each more terrible than the last, that might await the captured ancient. We have also examined the Blood Angels' response, the fury and devotion with which they pursue recovery or revenge, the elaborate rituals through which they process their grief and rage, the protocols they establish to prevent future disasters. We have considered the broader implications for the Imperium, the uncomfortable truths this scenario reveals about imperial values and priorities, the practical and philosophical questions it raises about the price of eternal service. What emerges from this exploration is a picture of Warhammer 40k at its darkest and most tragic. This is not a universe where the righteous are protected or the faithful rewarded. This is a universe where even the mightiest warriors can be broken, where service to the Emperor offers no guarantee of dignity in death, where the most sacred things can be profaned by enemies, too savage to even comprehend the magnitude of their crimes. And yet, even in this darkness, there is something approaching nobility. The Blood Angels do not abandon their brothers. They do not dismiss the captured pilot's suffering as regrettable but unavoidable collateral damage. They mobilize their full resources to recover or avenge him. They change their practices to reduce the likelihood of similar disasters. They remember him as an individual rather than as a statistic. They acknowledge that his suffering matters, even if the universe itself is indifferent to suffering. This commitment to each other, this refusal to let pragmatic necessity completely override personal loyalty and honor, is what makes the Space Marines heroic, despite serving a regime that is fundamentally brutal and oppressive. They maintain their humanity, or transhumanity, in circumstances designed to strip it away. They care about their brothers when it would be easier not to care. They fight not just for the Emperor's abstract glory, but for the concrete reality of the warriors standing beside them. The captured Dreadnought story, then, is ultimately about limits, the limits of flesh and will under torture. The limits of faith, when confronted with senseless suffering. The limits of honor in a universe that does not respect it. The limits of technology to protect those it was meant to serve. But also the limits of despair, because even in the worst scenarios, there remains the possibility of rescue, of vengeance, of meaningful response to meaningless cruelty. For those of us exploring the Warhammer 40k universe, from outside its fictional boundaries, scenarios like this one serve as reminders of what makes this setting so compelling and so distinctive. This is not heroic fantasy where goodness triumphs and justice prevails. This is not even tragic fiction where suffering is redeemed through sacrifice. This is something darker and more complex, where horror and heroism coexist, where the best and worst of sentient nature appear side by side, where there are no easy answers and no comfortable resolutions. The captured Blood Angel's Dreadnought is a thought experiment in sustained awfulness, an examination of what happens when everything that can go wrong does go wrong, when every safeguard fails and every hope is disappointed. It is nightmare fuel for those who love the Blood Angels, and tragic validation for those who have always suspected that the Imperium's promises of glory and honor in service are lies told to soldiers to make them more willing to die. But it is also, in its own perverse way, a testament to resilience. If the pilot survives long enough to be rescued, he has endured torments that would drive baseline humans insane within moments. If he dies in captivity, he has maintained his identity and his faith despite everything the Orks could do to break him. If his brothers recover his remains, they have proven that some bonds cannot be severed even by death and desecration. And if they cannot recover him, they have at least ensured that he will be remembered, that his suffering will not be dismissed or forgotten, that his story will serve as warning and inspiration to future generations. In the end, that may be all any warrior can hope for in the grim darkness of the far future. To be remembered, to have mattered, to have one's suffering and sacrifice acknowledged by those who come after. The captured Dreadnought, whether he lives or dies, whether he is rescued or lost, achieves at least that much. His story is told. His name is spoken with reverence. His chapter mourns him and vows to prevent similar fates from befalling his brothers. It is a cold comfort, perhaps, insufficient recompense for the horrors he endured. But in a universe where the alternatives are often so much worse, where entire worlds are scoured of life without anyone noticing, where billions die in anonymity, serving the Imperium's insatiable war machine, even this limited form of remembrance represents a victory against the darkness that seeks to erase all meaning and all identity. So we remember the captured Blood Angel Dreadnought, this hypothetical warrior whose suffering we have explored in exhaustive detail. We remember him not because his story is uplifting or inspirational in any conventional sense, but because remembering is an act of defiance against a universe that wants us to forget, that wants us to accept that suffering is meaningless and individuals do not matter. We remember, and in remembering, we honor not just the fictional character, but the broader principle he represents, that consciousness matters, that suffering is real even when it serves no purpose, that loyalty and brotherhood have value even when they cannot prevent disaster. These are not revolutionary insights, perhaps, but in the context of Warhammer 40k's deliberately bleak setting, they are worth affirming. The captured Dreadnought is a nightmare, certainly, but he is a nightmare that proves, by its very awfulness, that something is worth protecting. If we did not value consciousness and dignity, if we did not believe that suffering matters, the capture would merely be the destruction of a valuable piece of equipment. It is because we, and the Blood Angels, and even the universe itself in some cosmic sense, recognize that there was a person in that shell, that the violation is so profound, and the response so intense. In this way, the darkest stories in Warhammer 40k paradoxically affirm the values they seem to negate. They show us what happens when those values are violated, and in doing so, they remind us why those values matter. The captured Dreadnought suffers so that we understand the importance of preventing such suffering. The Blood Angels rage and mourn so that we appreciate the bonds of brotherhood that make such emotions meaningful. The Imperium fails to protect its servant so that we recognize protection as something worth striving for, even when it cannot always be achieved. If you found this exploration of one of Warhammer 40k's darkest scenarios engaging, consider subscribing to this channel for more deep dives into the lore of the 41st Millennium. Like this video if you appreciate thorough analysis of the setting's most compelling and disturbing elements. And share your thoughts in the comments about how you think a Space Marine chapter should handle scenarios where honored ancients fall into enemy hands, and what protocols might prevent or mitigate such disasters. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But there are also stories worth telling, characters worth remembering, and principles worth upholding even when the universe seems determined to grind them into dust. The Captured Blood Angels. Dreadnought is one such story, and we honor him and all who share his fate by refusing to look away from their suffering, by acknowledging their sacrifice, and by remembering that they were more than equipment, more than statistics, more than assets in the Imperium's endless war. They were warriors who deserved better than the fates they received, and the least we can do is ensure that they are not forgotten. Thank you for watching, and may the Emperor protect you.